Bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos. Vamos a dar comienzo a una nueva clase del programa de estudios americanos, entendiendo al gobierno y la política en los Estados Unidos de América, dirigida aquí por Congressman Baird, que está aquí a mi izquierda. Enseguida le voy a dar la palabra. Les agradecemos mucho. El día de hoy tenemos por objeto el estudio del Congreso de los Estados Unidos, nada menos. Así que, Brian, por favor, ven aquí.
Gracias.
Es tu turno. Gracias.
Well, good to see our honored guest from the Congress legislature here. Once again, thank you to all of you who are joining online, and to Sol, our marvelous interpreter, and of course, Juan de Dios. It is such an honor today. We've spent our time discussing the history of how the country got where it is today, our United States, and our Constitution. Today, we now talk about the first branch, the Article 1 of our Constitution branch, the United States Congress. And we have three extraordinary speakers who I will introduce in a moment. But I want to just start. Let me start by sharing my slides again, as always. I don't think it works. That's Sharon. One, can you tell? Yes. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
I want to start with 2 points that I think are true about any institution, but especially a democratic republic. The first point is that no matter how good no institution can be great without great people. But even great people can be defeated or blocked by bad institutions. The second real problem we face, I think, in all democracies right now is that the skills it takes to acquire, that are required to gain power, to be elected, and the attitudes and the behaviors are so different than what it takes nowadays to be governed. So people who govern well may not get elected, and people who get elected may not govern well. It's a challenge we face. So what we're going to talk about today is how the Congress is structured, how the people get elected, how it functions, how bills become law. I bet you this many of you know already, and what motivates members of Congress, and if time allows, we'll talk about congressional ethics. I always like to start with what I believe are the qualities that I would like to see in people who get elected to Congress. I've listed 12 here that you can see on your screen. It includes a motive to serve the greater good. It's the first and most important thing. You have to have that as the reason you run for Congress. Humility, I think, is important. You have to realize that you may have flaws yourself and that other people have strengths that you don't have, and learn to respect that. You should respect the Constitution. You should respect your colleagues. Respect the institution of Congress. When I served in Congress, and I'm sure it's true of my friends here from the legislature, I was told, if you ever take this job for granted, it's time to quit. If you aren't every single day aware of the great responsibility that is placed upon you, if you forget that, then it's time to stop. Third is curiosity. These are complex issues, and you have to be curious about the facts, but also how are other people, be respectfully curious of other people with other ideas. Where did they get those ideas? Why are they important to them? So curiosity. Third is, sixth, I think I'm at now, is listening. I used to tell beginning candidates for Congress, listen, win, talk, lose. Voters want you to listen to them, not to hear you talk at them. They want to know that you're interested in who they are and what they care about. Hard work. Congress and the legislature, whether it's Argentina or the United States, is hard work if you do it right. The complexity of the issues, the amount of time you have to spend. A gentleman recently asked me if he should run for Congress, and I listened to him, and he didn't want to do the work. And I said to him, you know, with respect, you're afraid this is going to impact your lifestyle. Yes, it will be everything. It will be all that you do. If you don't want that commitment, find something else. Next is intelligence. You don't have to be a genius to serve in Congress. but it's complicated material, and you need to be able to learn fast and learn many things rapidly. Something we almost never talk about is foresight, the ability to look ahead and see what the future holds. Too many members of Congress have no horizon past the next election. And we need to be able to look to the next generation, not just the next election. You have to be willing to compromise, I believe. For some, compromise is not a positive thing. I believe it's essential to govern well. You also have to base your decisions on fact. It seems that would be something we would take for granted or assume. But now there are many people who don't base their decisions on actual fact. And then next to last is courage. Congress is not a place where you have an easy job. You have to sometimes do difficult things, say difficult things, go to dangerous places, and sometimes even risk your life to do the job well, I believe. But not everyone has such courage. And last but not least, integrity. And the principle for me is this: you have to be willing to lose the job in order to deserve the job. So with those principles, the challenge is, I don't think you can do the job as well as it should be done because of the way the institution is structured right now. And we're going to talk about why. We're also going to hear from people who are trying to change the institution. Let me give a very brief introduction now on my time, so when we get their time, I don't spend it telling them what they already know about themselves. All three of these people, I should say, are dear friends. They're some of the most respected people in their fields. And each one of them immediately said they would be delighted to do this class because they believe in sharing and learning about other democracies. The first we'll hear from today is Norm Ornstein. He was formerly a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a center-right think tank. Norm and I we've years together on congressional continuity. He has, for the last 4 decades, been, if you said, name the top 3 or 4 scholars and objective thinkers about the Congress, Norm Ornstein's name would come up. He's often called upon for major media appearances. He writes columns in major newspapers. He's a brilliant man, and we're so honored to have him. After Norm, we are going to hear from Jean Bordowich. Jean's husband, Fergus Bordowich, was our speaker at the class on the first Congress. They're a power couple, as you could say. Jean has served in the state legislature and the county council. She was a staff member for the Senate Rules Committee. She has worked on, among other things, electoral reform, addressing the challenge of the filibuster, and we served together also on the Continuity of Government Commission. And interestingly, Jean is also a playwright who's done a couple of plays at theater festivals, one of which dealt with the McCarthy anti-communism years. So she is a woman of many, many talents. Jean's task, because I did not serve in the Senate, Jean Bordowich is going to talk to you about the Senate. So when I do my prepared remarks at the opening and then at the closing, I will not focus heavily on the Senate because Jean is far more expert at that than I, and they are different cultures, the House and the Senate. Next, we're going to hear from Brad Fitch. He'll be our last speaker. Brad is the head of a group called the Congressional Management Foundation, which is relatively unique, I believe, a completely nonpartisan organization dedicated to improving how the Congress and the staff function. They do it on a nonpartisan basis, the premise being we're not here to promote one party over another. We're here to promote the institution and the institutional functioning. So Brad Fitch will join us. Again, the head of the Congressional Management Foundation. Brad does lectures with parliaments around the world, actually remotely, and he was essential in his organization in helping members of Congress and their staff cope with the after effects of the January 6th attacks. So we have 3 distinguished speakers, all dedicated to trying to help the Congress function better. Norm Ornstein will join us at 45 past the hour. He'll speak for 45 minutes. Then we'll hear from Jean, and then we'll hear from Brad. And at the end, and each time they'll speak for about 2/3 of their time, followed by opportunities for questions from the group here, and as always, the group at home. So with that, very briefly, we've covered the constitutional requirement. It's Article 1 by design. The framers of our Constitution put the legislative branch first and foremost. So basically, it says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress comprised of a House and a Senate. You know all that. Other basics, we're going to go fast through the basics. 435 voting members of the House. There are 5 delegates. These are from American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, etc. They don't have a vote in the final House, but they have representation in the Congress. Members of Congress serve for 2 years. Unlike in Argentina, the entire U.S. Congress, or U.S. House rather, is up for election every 2 years. Now, some people have very secure seats. No one runs against them. They're pretty sure they'll be elected. I was not so fortunate, although I was fortunate. I was in a very challenging district. It could have been either way almost every time. I think that builds character, but that wasn't easy, I can say for sure. But nevertheless, we all stand for election every 2 years. The Senate, as you know, 100 members. Every state in the Senate gets 2, or every state in the country gets 2 senators. Senators serve 6-year terms. The elections, I think, similar to here. Oh, this is, I'm being called by one. That's it. The 6-year term, so a third of the Senate is elected every 2 years, unless there was a person who passed away or retired from the Senate, then they'll have a special election. So sometimes they're more frequent than that. The number of House seats is interesting. It's 435, but when that number was established, it was 1911. The size of our House has not grown in more than 100 years, even though the population is now 3 times what it used to be, which makes the task of being a House member more complex and more challenging. It's actually a very interesting proposal, and I cite this reference here, that we would increase the number of House members. I think the complexity of the job and the desire for closer representation would warrant a larger House. We'd have to adjust how we sit in the room, but I think it's worth considering. The Senate, as I said, every state gets 2 senators, which makes the states equal in power. But the voters in some states, the small population states, actually have far more proportionate power. Their vote has much more power than a single vote in another state. To illustrate that, here's a chart showing how Wyoming, a very scarcely populated state where I got my graduate degree actually in psychology, Wyoming has a lot of open space. There are parts of Argentina that are very, very similar. If you look at some of the wild lands in the south, for example, they look somewhat like Wyoming and is similarly scarcely populated. This chart shows that in a state, you can see state by state. In California, 59, I think it is, voters. One person in Montana is comparable to 59 voters in Los Angeles, or rather in California. So the Senate current balance of power, there are 3 independent members who they meet with the Democratic side, but they're independents. The rest, 48 are Democrats and 49 are Republicans. So the Democrats plus those who join them, the 3 independents, outnumber the Republicans by 1. What that means is that a single change in vote can change the affiliation, can change the party power in the Senate, as could the death of a senator, as could an assassination, as could somebody switching parties. Here's a map showing the representation. This is actually a good map. It's from an unusual source that I don't usually cite, which is Wikipedia, I think, but it's quite good. It's one of the best I've seen. And it shows some states, I think 5 states now, have both a Democrat and a Republican or an independent. So the parties are split, but it's the lowest number it's been in many, many years. So that's the Senate. Jean's going to talk about how the Senate functions when she arrives later on. She hopefully, I think, may be watching now. But let's talk a little bit about the House. 435 seats. Every 10 years, our United States Census counts how many people are in the country, where they are, et cetera. And based on that, they decide how many House seats each state will get. Sometimes states lose seats. The population has declined relative to other states. Sometimes they gain seats if they had people move in or their population has grown. The census every year tells how many people are, and then the states make the decisions about how to draw the congressional boundary. The rule is basically, so here's the census map. Again, as always, I'm giving a lot of information that the scholars among you can cite if you want to do further research. I'm trying to save you the trouble and provide good resources. Here's the map of the entire country with each county in each state listed. Counties are mid-sized level government, bigger than towns, but smaller than the state, obviously. And then it narrows in. And I show you this next slide really because I want you to see in a state like California, if you look to the north, I don't know, can you see my cursor when I do this? If you look here, this is the San Francisco area up in the north part of California. Down here in the lower part, that's Los Angeles and San Diego. Those population concentrations have lots of seats, whereas in the rural areas, you see much greater geography. And that's illustrated even more, perhaps, in my own district, where you see that little arrow, that was my district. Now, to give you a sense of the scale of that district, if you go to the lower right, the southeast corner, and if you were to drive from the southeast corner to the upper northwest corner of my district, it was about 240 miles. So that's what?
300 kilometers.
What's that?
300 and something.
More than that, I think. Yeah, it's hundreds of kilometers across. Now, the contrast there is interesting. The smallest congressional district in the United States is actually only 10 square miles, which is nothing. I could walk across there and I could fly across mine. It's an amazing difference. One of the things that happens in our country when it comes time to draw the congressional boundaries is a process called gerrymandering, sometimes pronounced gerrymandering, named after an early representative in the Congress who they drew a very complex district to make sure he could win again. And the newspaper said, that doesn't look like a district, it looks like a salamander, which is a lizard. And so they began to call it a gerrymander, and the term is still used today. So populations, the number of people in a district in a state or in each congressional district per state has to be the same. You can't have one district with 700,000 members and another with 200,000. You basically say, how many seats in the House does this state get? Divide that by, or divide the population of the state by that. Each district has to have that same amount. The question is, though, how do you draw that and who draws it? States vary in their practices. Later in this course, we're going to have a whole course on partisanship, polarization, and the election process, and we'll go into great detail, but you need to have a sense of gerrymandering and districts to make sense here. Here's an example of a North Carolina map that was drawn to favor Republicans. What happens is you draw your map in such a way that you either split up, for example, a minority group, blacks or Democrats, oftentimes similar in voting preference, or you concentrate them in so that everybody is in one group so that you get that seat, but you waste a lot of votes, right? So it's called cracking or packing. Here are some maps of North Carolina. The key point here is even though blacks and whites in North Carolina are about even and Democrats and Republicans in total numbers, it's a disproportionate representation in the Congress because of the way the maps are drawn. So the maps are drawn purposefully to advantage one party or another. Here's an even crazier map. This is in the state of Maryland. This makes no sense at all. But interestingly enough, the person who represents this district says this is, even he thinks it's ridiculous. He says, it's stupid. You should change this. In North Carolina, they have fought efforts to change their map. This gentleman says, of course, my district makes no sense. This was drawn by a partisan legislature to make sure that they could hold this seat and to keep people from winning other seats. There are efforts to change this, but as always in this class, it seems that every time I prepare one of these classes, within 2 to 3 days before the class, something immediate happens that shows the importance of this. This is a slide of Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis, who's running for the United States presidency, rejected a map that had been produced earlier, created his own map. The legislature passed it. It is a map that just Saturday, a court ruled is biased against blacks and said you can't use this map in the upcoming election. Now, the state of Florida will resist this, but this is happening literally within. So this is the map DeSantis drew. And basically what it does is it disenfranchises, even though there's a significant black population in Florida, there are no districts that will be represented by blacks, at least the way the boundaries are drawn, and fewer Hispanic districts, even though Hispanics make up a significant portion of the population of Florida, as you all know. So the courts literally just Saturday, a court said, we're going just this, 4 days ago, 3 days ago, the court said, we don't think, we believe that the map is biased against blacks, doesn't allow them fair representation, and we are ruling that you have to go back. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court, as you remember from our conversation with Judge Ho a few sessions ago, the Supreme Court will then hear the case likely, and frankly, the U.S. Supreme Court has basically said, in general, we are not going to tell states how to do their business. I think it's a disingenuous argument. I think they act like, oh, we're not smart enough to make these decisions. Well, I think if you're not smart enough, then you shouldn't be in the Supreme Court, perhaps. And anyway, it'll go there almost for sure. So what's the makeup of the House? The House has 213 Democrats, 222 Republicans, for a total of 435. That's a close margin. A while back, it was 5. The margin was 5, which means anything could happen to change the balance of power. So that's the current margin in the House. I'm going to do a series of maps here to sort of illustrate several concepts. This map shows the district makeup, which districts are held by Democrats, the Democrats now in blue, the Republicans in red. It could look like, oh gosh, most of America is Republican, but that's because of geography. Republicans tend to dominate in the scarcely populated rural states, whereas Democrats tend to be more populated in the urban states. The other key thing to understand is, even though a Democrat or a Republican may win a seat and then it gets colored entirely blue or entirely red, that doesn't mean that everybody there is a Republican or a Democrat. This map shows that the country is really more purple. Even in areas that are bright red on the map, there are plenty of Democrats, and in areas where are bright blue, there are plenty of Republicans. The challenge is they may never have enough to win. So I know people who have never in their life voted for a candidate who won an election, because they're either in Seattle, if they're a conservative Republican, in my city of Seattle, but I don't live in it, but you're not going to win. In Eastern Washington, if you're a very liberal Democrat, you're not going to win. And so voters, I think, get very frustrated by that. There are some ways to solve that through ranked choice voting, or what are called multi-member districts that we'll talk about in a later class. This is an analysis of the districts, not just by did a Democrat win or a Republican win, but what are the general margins? And you'll see here, it's not as bright red or as bright blue. This, by the way, is from the Cook Political Report, probably the most respected analysts of American elections overall, year in, year out, a source of great information. They not only look at the voting totals, they interview the candidates, they look at a host of historical variables, a great source. So this is the source, the reference if you need it. This next map I love, if I can make it work. So what this map is going to do is it's going to start showing representation by geography, and then it's going to shift to if the map were reflect, the colors on the map reflected population. We'll see if I can make this work. Yep, we're going to have it work. So watch as it shifts. If you look at this map, you say, golly gee, America, the United States is totally Republican. But now let's look at population. Whoop, shoot, I messed it up. I'll do it again. I was trying to stop it. So that's more population. So if you gave population a geometric representation, you see there's almost the same number. In fact, in many elections, there are more people who vote Democratic than Republican, but they're more concentrated in the cities, so their margin of victory is easier. But it's so as far the geographically, it looks red. Population-wise, it's purple or blue and red. So what are some differences in congressional districts? Well, one is politics. There are secure districts, as I mentioned, and there are swing districts. But one of the problems with our democracy right now, our democratic republic, is there are fewer and fewer swing districts. People are either hard Republican, hard Democrat, and that means there are fewer people who have to work across the aisle. And I think that's a problem for a representative democracy. There are huge differences in geography. We showed you some of those. It's a different experience, I can tell you, to represent a state clear across the United States of America, have to fly home every week, some 5-hour flight, and then drive through your district, and then to represent an area that's 200 miles from corner to corner versus somebody who's a half hour away from the District of Columbia or 2 hours from by train, and they can walk across their district. There's also differences in ethnicity. There's differences in religious diversity, differences in economics, and different districts, as you can imagine, have different economic interests. All of those shape people voting. One of the sad things I think in our country more and more is people are voting so much on party lines that if you just look at the history of a district and its demographic makeup, you can predict the outcome of the election before people vote in a great number of the elections that we have now. And again, that causes people to not be sensitive and listen to the positions of other people. In 2022, only 8 incumbents lost in the general election, but there were 14 who lost in primaries. A primary, of course, is where someone from your own party says, I don't want you there anymore, and they run against you. In my old district, that's exactly what happened. The Republican incumbent had voted to impeach Donald Trump, which I thought was a courageous vote myself, but the Republican base thought it was outrageous. They ran an extremist candidate against her. He won in the primary and then was narrowly defeated in the general election by a surprising winner from the Democratic side. But that was one of the losses in the primary. And in fact, many of these losses were people who either retired because they did not support Trump or they were defeated in a primary. But one of the things you see is that there's actually a fair number of new members in the Congress, and I'm going to go quickly through this. These are demographic issues. The numbers of Blacks, Hispanics, and women in a positive way have all been increasing over the last decade. So this is a racial breakdown, and you'll see more and more Hispanic representation, more and more Black representation, or Asian American representation. And I can't remember if it's shown on here, but also more multi-gender sexual orientation representation as well. The number of women has grown dramatically. It is still far less than the population reference. And that's for a number of reasons. Gender bias, women raising children, it makes it awfully hard to run for Congress and serve in Congress if you've got a kid. And there's bias among voters. Actually, more and more women are running and having having children while in Congress. And I think that's fantastic. My wife and I had twins when I was in Congress, and it was a challenge. I have some wonderful pictures of my little boys on the floor of the House of Representatives. I don't on the floor, but in the statuary hall right outside the floor of the House, playing hide and seek when I had a late night vote, because my wife did global health. So she would be on the road. If my pager went off, I'd get my sleepy little boys, put them in the stroller, and take them to the Congress to vote. And there's some funny stories, which I'll tell you another time. But there's actually a fair bit of turnover in the House. If you look here in the House over the last 4 elections, there have been what's the total now? Almost 65% turnover in 8 years. That's a lot of turnover. That's a lot of new members. The Senate less so. But still some. I think I'm sorry, but my screen's obscuring the bottom, I guess. Can you see that? I can't tell. Yeah, you can. Okay. So total turnover about 30%. Yeah, I can see it on there. Thank you. Most members are fairly new to the job. I will tell you, sometimes there's a proposal in the states to limit how long a member of Congress can serve. Some of the early proposals have said 6 years. I think after 6 years, I finally didn't get lost on my way to the Capitol anymore. 6 years is too little. I've been thinking lately, though, that 25 or 30 years might be reasonable, but the voters can term limit you anytime they want. If they think you're not doing the job, they can say time for someone else. So I've not been a fan of term limits. And in fact, there's a lot of turnover in the Congress anyway. Now, here's a surprise to many people. The House and Senate, as Gene will talk about, and Norm probably as well in just a moment, are vastly different cultures. And it shocked me how little we interacted with our senators. There's resentment actually between the parties. There's an old joke that a new member of the House, a freshman, there was a vote in which the opposition party was going to lose the vote. And the young member said to the more senior member of his own party, "We're really giving it to the enemy today, aren't we, sir?" And the more senior member put his arm around the young member and said, "Son, the other party is the other party. They're not the enemy. The enemy is the Senate." There's also a funny joke. I think it was one of the U.S. presidents. In the old days, the White House was completely open. I mean, people could come in at any hour of the day, and literally people did come in at most hours of the day. And the first lady at the time woke up and said to her husband and said, "Dear, I think there might be a burglar in the house." And her husband said, "No, not in the house, maybe the Senate." So there's rivalry. The other thing that surprised me is how relatively little interaction we have in the Congress with state governments. Even though we impact the states, they impact us. It's surprising how little we communicate with states. Now, I think I personally was an exception to that, because every time I came home, if I went to a community, I always let their mayors know, "I'm here, Pac. I want to hear what your opinion is." I always had good relationships with both sides of the aisle from my state legislators. Sometimes they then ran against me, but that's okay. We had good relationships. It was my job to work with them and represent them, sometimes resent them. But it's not always. It's not as close a relationship as one might think. Here, in case you're interested, here's a map of the makeup of state legislatures, which party controls the legislature. It's pretty similar to the congressional maps, not perfectly similar. Hugely consequential because the legislatures draw the congressional boundaries. The legislatures determine, among other things, how elections are going to be held, and actually have some say over who the electors for president are going to be. This may be a major issue in the next election. Here's a map of governors as they currently stand by party affiliation. Some people believe that some of those states are blue because of Donald Trump, which is paradoxical if you're a Donald Trump fan. They believe that several governors won, I think this is true, as a reaction against Donald Trump's extremes. So that's the governors. We just mentioned the numbers of ways that the federal government impacts our state are huge. Transportation funding, trade policies, whether it affects agriculture, major infrastructure spending, tax basis that advance one state or another, disasters, which we're having many of now. Congress affects the states in incredible ways, but again, there's not as much connection as there might be. In case somebody's interested in the historical maps of partisan balance, this article will be good. I'm not going to go into it, but it's a useful resource for those of you who are scholars in the group. So how do we choose our leadership in the House? It's by direct election, by the members themselves. And it's quite contested, as you may have seen in the last, when the Congress convened, the hard right in the Republican Party, the so-called Freedom Caucus, freedom for themselves, I think, not for others sometimes, but the so-called Freedom Caucus held out and made Kevin McCarthy, who became the Speaker of the House, basically make a lot of sacrifices. I think too many, but he had no choice. But it's a direct election process. Speakers are not necessarily chosen for their ability to manage the institution, but usually for their partisan negotiating skills and oftentimes for their fundraising skills. The British, I believe, as our scholars here know, have a different model that is of an independent Speaker of the House who's not a partisan tool. In fact, the British tradition I love, it is that when the person is selected as the Speaker, they kind of drag him to the front reluctantly because he has to abandon his party to abjure, to reject partisanship, to make sure the House of Commons is represented well. And my dear friend, the former U.S. parliamentarian Charles Johnson, has written a wonderful book. It's very inside but a wonderful book comparing the British parliamentary system with the American Congress and their parliamentary rules. It's a thick book, but hugely interesting and insightful. Within the Congress, the Democrats form what is called the Democratic Caucus. That caucus is a group of members who share something in Congress or in common. The Republicans call themselves a Republican Conference. Same thing, just different names. So the Democratic Caucus is when all the Democrats and the independents who caucus with the Democrats meet. The Republican Conference is all the Republicans meeting. They choose their own leaders, separate from the House, the Speaker of the House, the majority and the minority leader. And then there are people called whips, which are people who keep the party organization running. So I was a member of the whips team. When we had a close vote, it was my job to pick a group of members and talk to them and say, how are you going to vote on this? Why are you voting this way? Do you need more information? Is there something we can do to get your vote, etc.? That's the whips organization. It provides for party loyalty. So how do bills become laws? Here's the actual official story. It's written by he's now retired, John Sullivan, the parliamentarian. It's, I think, a 36-page book, but you can get it. And the reference source is right there. So this is the official story of how, are we okay? Are we all right? ¿Estamos bien? Okay. Sigo. ¿Qué sé yo? So this is the official story of how legislation is enacted. The parliamentarians, by the way, I should say, are nonpartisan in the U.S. system. They are professional staff. They advise the Congress equally on both sides. They have strict confidentiality. If I had some controversial things I wanted to try to do on the floor, and I could go to the parliamentarian and be absolutely 100% confident in two things. I would get accurate information, unbiased, and it was confidential. He was not going to tell the speaker from the other side, oh, better watch it. Congressman Baird is going to try a parliamentary maneuver. And they do that for everybody. They give us advice. During the session of Congress, the speaker, the person in the chair is often not very knowledgeable about parliamentary procedure. And you'll oftentimes see the parliamentarian right beside them handing up a little note. And then the speaker takes a note and says, according to Clause 7-6, Section A of the House Rules, we have no idea what we're saying. He could have us saying a silly limerick, and we would just read it until a silly joke. But they know everything, and we take their word for it. Sometimes, when it's a very contentious issue, the very best speaker will be chosen to occupy that. Speaking of great speakers, I hope, has Norm Ornstein joined us? Yes. Norm, are you there? Norm, I am here. Hello, Norm. So good to hear you. I'm going to stop my screen share and let me see if I can get my glasses on. Norm, where are you? Oh, there you are. Norm, I gave an introduction that you and your wife would be proud of. I didn't want to take your time for the introduction. To make it simple, Norm Ornstein is one of the people I most respect. If I had a question about the Congress, what's happening, what has happened, what are the traditions, Norm Ornstein would be the person I would go to. He is a brilliant person, humble, insightful, absolutely studious. He cares deeply and passionately about the institution of the United States Congress. And it's truly a fact. We could not have a better person as our first guest speaker to talk about the Congress. I always learn something from and with Norm. He's a friend, he's a role model, a mentor, and I'm deeply honored that he could join us. Norm, you are accompanied today among our guests. We have members of the Parliament, the head of the Circle of Legislators here, which is the combined current and former members association. They do it very interestingly here. Former members of the Congress. There are international guests, members of international Congresses here with us remotely. Norm, if you'll speak to us for about 30 minutes or so, then we'll take some questions. And I get to sit and yet again, learn from your wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Norm Ornstein.
Thank you very much, Brian. So let me make some initial observations. The first is really about the whole nature of our political system. And I know that we have some parallels with yours. But if you go back to when the United States was founded, the people that crafted our Constitution, the framers as we call them, very deliberately chose the term Congress, even though what they knew was, of course, the British system, a parliamentary system. But the word Congress was not just taken because they didn't want to use the same word that the British had. It was for a larger purpose. Parliament comes from the French word parler, and that means, of course, to speak. And as you all know from a parliamentary system, you have a government chosen in an election. The government makes decisions. They go to the parliament. The members of the majority party, the prime minister's party, basically reflexively support what the government has done. The opposition party reflexively opposes. The parley, the speaking, comes in the question period, where the minority at least has the opportunity to pose tough questions to the majority. The public accepts the legitimacy of this system because they know that within 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, if they like what the ruling party and government has done, they can bring them back. If they don't, they can bring in an opposition that will do something very different. Our system that the framers created was built on a different premise, and it was partly because the United States, as it was going to be formed, was so large. They referred to it as an extended republic. It was going to be a republic where representatives would be chosen by voters and they would then act on their behalf. But they also believed that they needed, with all of these disparate places, including states that were very far apart at the time, that where the contrast with rural areas where people could live in the 1780s and 90s in places where they might not see any other people, neighbors, for weeks at a time, to urban areas like Philadelphia and New York that were much more densely populated, and people who had such dramatically different lives. A belief that if you did a parliament, you'd impose conditions and the public would not accept the legitimacy. So Congress comes from the Latin word meaning to come together. And the whole idea here was that you would gather in one place people who had such varied backgrounds and different perspectives, and they would debate and deliberate. And over time, organically, they would come to an agreement or a consensus on things that would be more widely accepted, and that people who lost under those circumstances would at least say, we had our opportunity to get our ideas across. But also, they believed that by meeting face to face, that some of these individuals in the Congress would be able to put themselves in the shoes of others and understand at least where they were coming from. And that in turn would add to the legitimacy. It's a very good theory. And I would say that, unfortunately, as with many theories, it doesn't always work the way you want in reality. And in recent decades, we have had, and especially in the last 20 years or so, we have had, I think, a fundamental challenge to that broader notion of what a Congress is supposed to do for a couple of reasons. One of the main ones is that with what is now a tribal political system, where members of our two political parties and those who identify with them no longer see the other side as legitimate actors who may have different perspectives, but they're good Americans trying to do the right thing, to viewing them as the enemy trying to destroy our way of life. But along with that, it is the rise of social media, tribal media, where the whole theory of coming together to debate and deliberate to try and solve major problems facing the society is built on the idea that you at least start with a common set of facts and a common belief in what the big problems are. So take one of the best examples now, climate change. We cannot have a debate in Congress about climate change when one of the parties in the majority in the House of Representatives believes that there is no such thing as human climate change and that it is a hoax, and that's reinforced by their presidential candidates. And so we don't have a way of solving these major problems. And then just to take that to another level, the governor of Florida, a major candidate for the presidency, for the Republican nomination, Ron DeSantis, turned down $346 million that was supposed to go to help deal with the effects of severe weather and climate change, because it would mean that you're admitting that there is such a thing. So we're now in a position where the ability to have reasonable debates about major issues in so many instances, to debate and deliberate, just doesn't exist anymore. Now, along with that, the dream that you would actually have serious debates with lots of face-to-face interaction really hasn't been a reality for much longer than that. We've had debates, but the fact is, in the nature of our political system, and Brian could tell you a lot about this from his time when he served, now, because we have the two parties closely divided, because we have turnover on a regular, fairly frequent basis of who's in the majority. Right now, of course, in our Senate, we have a very slender majority for Democrats. In the Congress before this, it was a 100-member Senate divided 50-50. Now it's just slightly more than that. The Republicans in the House of Representatives, 435 members, have a 5-seat majority. That can shift at any time. And the consequences of change are dramatic because of the vastly different positions that the two parties take on so many of these issues. So the stakes are much higher, and the need to raise large sums of money to try to prevail are much greater. And our campaign finance laws, affected by a more radical Supreme Court, mean that wealthy individuals, billionaires, or companies can sweep into a race right at the end and put in large sums of money, dominate the advertising, and affect the outcomes. So members spend as much of their time when they're in Washington racing away from the Capitol to raise money. And beyond that, we just don't have much of an ability to debate when people look at the world ways. So we have real difficulty now with a Congress that was always designed to move slowly. It wasn't as if they were going to say, oh, we've got this big problem, let's swoop in and come up with a solution. That is a challenge in the 20th and 21st centuries, when you have a global society and the need often to move more quickly. But that has become a bigger problem given the reality that we can't even debate some of these major issues. The other element of this is that, of course, and it's something, again, with which you are familiar, when the framers set up this system, it was 3 independent branches of government: a Congress, an executive, a judiciary. They specified in a lot of detail the powers of Congress. They specified in less detail, but still a fair amount, the powers of the presidency. Very little on the judiciary, which they expected would be a more passive actor in the process, and it was going to be shaped by the Congress. There was very limited original jurisdiction given to a Supreme Court, and then Congress created other courts and gave them more jurisdiction. But it was also clear that we couldn't, if we were going to have these separate branches, and a Congress where the House is elected separately from the Senate and from the presidency. And of course, our House elections every 2 years where everybody's up. Our Senate elections where there are 6-year terms and a third are up in any given election, and a presidential election every 4 years, which means every 4 years the presidential candidates run with all of the House and a third of the Senate. But it meant that we were going to have frequent occasions where government would be divided, where one party would hold one or both houses of Congress, the other party might hold the presidency. And if you had a parliamentary system where the parties are here, unite together, the party that's not in the majority in opposition, you would have no ability to get anything done if you had divided government. So it was always expected, and the parties were not even mentioned in our Constitution, that you would have different kinds of coalitions, but also that because one of our great scholars of our Constitution, almost 100 years ago, referred to our Constitution and the relationships among the branches as an invitation to struggle. There was going to be a lot of looseness there, and they would each have to protect their own prerogatives and try to make sure that you could still make things work. But all of that was built around a belief that people would have to shift positions so that you could actually make things happen, and that they would have fierce loyalty to their own institutions. In recent decades, as we have become more polarized and tribalized, it becomes much harder to be able to govern when you have, right now, Republicans with a majority in the House dead set against most anything that the Democratic Senate and the Democratic president want to do. But also, you don't have much of a sense of loyalty to their own institution. People who are being recruited to office now and recruited to Congress are doing it more because of their own deep and often radical ideological beliefs, or because of their bitter opposition to the other side, the enemy trying to destroy our way of life. So we have other sets of challenges to the ability to govern right now. And in some ways, it's almost miraculous that we've been able to see some actions taken that have been able, for example, to rebuild our infrastructure, to help navigate through the COVID epidemic, to at least make some progress on climate. But in other areas like immigration, we are not able to act. And of course, taking dramatic steps to be able to solve some of these problems, from healthcare to the environment, to immigration, become much harder. And even in areas where you have a broader consensus, for example, American aid to Ukraine, we're now finding great stresses there. And we're likely headed, because of the radical positions of some of the Republicans in the House and the unwillingness to try and work together, we're likely headed to a shutdown of government and an inability to be able to actually act to solve a lot of these problems, beginning in another month or so, as our new fiscal year occurs on October 1. So those are problems where the design of a political system 200 and almost 50 years ago doesn't necessarily work the way it was supposed to when you move to a dramatically different society and world, but also the problems that can occur just because some of the things in a society, cultural changes and technological changes, don't measure up with the nature of your political system, and you can't make that work. Now, let me talk about another problem. And of course, let me say, a lot of these issues that I've talked about preceded Donald Trump. They were moving in that direction before Donald Trump became a national political figure or became a president. And they've been exacerbated or deepened tremendously because of his corrosive role in our politics. But many of them that preceded Trump will be there whenever he disappears from public life. And then we have a larger set of issues that I want to talk about for at least a few minutes that reflect a different kind of mismatch between the political system designed in the 1780s and the reality of our society now. Some of this, I'm sure, will be familiar to you from your other lectures and will probably be reinforced in other ways. But as you know, when our political system was designed and the framers created the Constitution, it was not like some revelation that came down from on high. It was a very pragmatic set of trade-offs from politicians who knew that to create this political system, they were going to have to get buy-in from all of those 13 colonies originally that became 13 states. And that to get a constitution ratified was going to take the approval of 3/4 of those states, and something that was going to be one where not everybody was necessarily going to be a winner. So almost every compromise that occurred was to bend over backwards to make sure that all the states, the large ones and the small ones, would get something and would be satisfied. Now, of course, a part of that set of compromises had to involve getting buy-in from the slave states in the South. And we know, and you're familiar with, I suspect, some, which included the so-called 3/5 compromise, where slaves would be counted as the government had power. You know, you get more representatives in Congress if you had more people, but they weren't going to be able to vote. They were not treated as human beings. And the compromise was they would get 3/5 of their amount counted when it came to distributing seats in the House of Representatives. But otherwise, almost every compromise meant bending over backwards to give more power to the states compared to the people as a whole. The one area where that was not so true was the House of Representatives. That was supposed to be more responsive to the people as a whole, and there were direct elections of those representatives. But what we have seen in this republic, where you have elected representatives to our House, is that for a couple of reasons, that's been distorted. We have elections every 2 years, but what's happened over a long period of time is that, in part because of where people live and where they naturally congregate, but as well because of the way the districts are divided, we have this phenomenon called gerrymandering, where you can distort the outcomes by creating districts that are not going to be representative of the public as a whole. And so our House of Representatives is less representative of the people and their viewpoint than it was 100 years ago or more. And that's becoming even more true, where in our House, 435 members, the districts are divided so that at least 375, and you could even push it to closer to 400, there is no question about what the outcome is going to be, because they're stacked for each of the two political parties. So the contest comes in a primary, and there it's whichever party is dominating in that district. Their primaries that choose those candidates usually have very low turnout, and they tend to reflect more of the more extreme views. And that's what has contributed to the polarization of our parties and a movement more towards extremes. That's been particularly true in those Republican districts. But what it also means is that the views of voters as a whole in the country become less significant in the Congress. A tiny fraction of the seats are actually competitive between the two parties. And those seats where you tend to get more centrist individuals emerging, or people who are not quite at an extreme because they have to reach out to a broader array of the electorate, those are also the ones that are most vulnerable in our elections. So we have a kind of a problem of legitimacy in the House. The one that's supposed to reflect most directly the views of the public as a whole is not reflecting those views nearly as much. One good example, guns. We know that 80 to 90% of Americans want more restrictions on guns. They want background checks for people before they can get guns. They want to limit the availability of some of the most destructive guns. 80 to 90%, nothing happens in Congress. That's not what the framers would have expected. And so we have a bigger problem in legitimacy there. Then we have a Senate. And when they created the Senate, the upper chamber, unlike most parliamentary systems where that chamber has limited power, our Senate was given direct and important responsibilities, equal in some ways in power to that of our House of Representatives. They have the power to accept or reject treaties by 2/3 vote. They have the power over confirmation of presidential executive nominees that require Senate confirmation, and of all federal judges. The Constitution, to mollify the states, our framers, gave every state, no matter how small or how large, 2 senators, and guaranteed in the Constitution that there would always be equal representation for the states in the Senate. Now, at the time that they created the Constitution, the ratio of population between the smallest state, which at the time was Delaware, Rhode Island was another one, and the largest states, the New Yorks and Pennsylvanias, the ratio was about 10 to 1, 10 times more people in the large states to the small states. Now it's 70 to 1. And so a small state, the smallest, with a population of barely more than 500,000, Wyoming, has the same power in the Senate as California, with 70 times as many people. But even more than that, in the modern era, people are moving to states where the economy is working. In a global economy, it's the urban states, the larger states, where the jobs are more secure, where you have an education infrastructure and a transportation infrastructure. So right now, we are almost at a point in our country where 70% of Americans will live in only 15 of our 50 states. Now, they're not all, those large states are not all blue states or states dominated by Democrats. We have places like Florida and Texas that are tend to be significantly more Republican. And the small states are not all Republican or conservative. That's true of an Alaska or a Wyoming, but it's not true of a Delaware or a Maine or a Rhode Island, also tiny states. But think about the consequences if 70% of Americans live in 15 of 50 states and every state gets 2 senators. That means we're almost at a point where 30% of our country will elect 70 of the 100 senators. And that 30% does not represent the growing diversity in the population. They tend to be more white, more rural, and the economy is driven by the 30%. 2/3 of our GDP, of our gross domestic product, is generated by those particular states. So increasingly, people are going to vote for a Senate that is not going to represent them or their views, and we're going to have more tension because those smaller states are going to demand more money from the big states, and they're going to have the votes to be able to get it, and people are going to feel as if the system is not legitimate. We also have, of course, our electoral college, which is in a similar situation where more and more power goes to these smaller states, which have more leverage for their population when it comes to selecting a president than the big states. And, you know, we've had a couple of elections since 2000 where the winner of the popular vote lost the presidency, and that 2016, where Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but where the views of voters do not get reflected in the outcomes, the more you're going to have a crisis of legitimacy. And we're getting close to that point, and that is a very worrisome thing for the country. We've been able to prevail significantly and to make it work reasonably well, but we have much bigger challenges now. And I haven't even gotten to some of the challenges to the fundamentals of our democracy, where you have a majority in the House now, where 2/3 of those members voted that Donald Trump won the election in 2020, and that Joe Biden, in effect, is not a legitimate president. That's not a great position for a country to be in, much less a country that needs to have the ability, given its position in the world, to be able to show leadership and to be able to show that it has the ability to solve those kinds of problems. So we're at a very difficult place in American government right now, and it's a particularly difficult place for the Congress, where you have divided government, but you also have serious questions about whether that set of legislators genuinely reflects more broadly what the country wants. We are, as many people have said, a republic, a Republican form of democracy with a small r. That means one where you're not having everything done directly by voters. They elect representatives, but those representatives are supposed to represent them. What happens when your representatives are no longer genuinely representing the broader country as a whole, and when, partly because of some of these dynamics, you have a court system that increasingly as well reflects the tribal identities out in the country, and itself has real questions about its legitimacy. This is not a position that we have seen in our country in our lifetimes, and it's becoming something that is deeply troubling to so many people who believe that our political system is fundamentally a good one and that it needs obviously some reforms, but where getting those reforms becomes even more difficult because of our tribal divisions. And Brian, I think that might be a good place for me to stop these initial remarks and see what kinds of questions we have.
Norm, thank you for that. As I listened to you, Norm, I couldn't help but imagine that you were writing the Federalist Papers. In other words, if Hamilton and Madison and Jay were reading it, saying, oh my goodness, this can't work. We've created a system where a minority of people are dictating to the majority of people, are electing people based on extremes, not on collaboration. They would, I'm sure they would lament that. And one of the great ironies is that the extreme wing on the right, particularly, calls themselves constitutionalists, alleging fealty to a document, loyalty to a document that was created itself by compromise, even as those who label themselves constitutionalists reject the idea of compromise. So, Norm, my dear friend and the gentleman who's hosting this and arranging this course that I'm privileged to teach, is Juan de Dios Cinconegui, who is a remarkable scholar of governments, especially international parliamentary systems. And he is going to field the questions now. The way we do this, Norm, is we take one question from the audience here, the distinguished audience here, and then we alternate it. So the next voice you'll hear is Juan de Dios Cinconegui. He will call on someone. They will ask the question in Spanish, and then you'll hear the translation from our wonderful translator, Sol, and then you'll answer in turn. So Juan de Dios Cinconegui, please.
Muchas gracias, Brian. Excelente presentación, doctor Bordewich. Vamos a hacer una pregunta aquí, los que están presenciales, y otra a los remotos. En los remotos,
Yes.
En los remotos tenemos a Laura Martín, que supongo que todos la conocen, que es una funcionaria importante de la Cámara Baja de Argentina. La pregunta es, por escrito, ¿hay un cupo para la participación de mujeres en el Congreso? Y bueno, ¿cuál es la regulación al respecto? Con respecto a gender equality.
Yes.
There is no quota. It's up to individual districts to choose candidates. What has happened in the last 3 decades especially is that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of women serving in Congress. And one of the most interesting developments in recent years is we're getting a significant number of women who served in the military, often in war, and others who've served in intelligence operations and at high levels of national security positions. That's a real change, and it's been a very, very positive one. We have a lot more women, but we are nowhere close to reflecting more broadly the society where women make up 51 to 52% of the population. But what has happened really is that the norms have changed enough that where in the past it was extremely difficult to find many districts where the establishment party figures were willing to put women forward as candidates. Now they seek out more women, but we're still, I suspect, decades away from having the kind of equal representation to fit the population that would be ideal.
Muchísimas
I
gracias.
should also add, we have very powerful women as well. We had perhaps the most powerful Speaker of the House, at least in our lifetimes, Nancy Pelosi, for a long time as Speaker. We have many powerful committee chairs now who are women, but still not reflecting the larger population.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta aquí? Adelante, por favor.
Sí. La pregunta tiene que ver en la composición del Congreso. Nuestro sistema electoral es muy distinto del sistema electoral inglés o del sistema electoral norteamericano. En las 435 representantes, los 435 diputados son 435 ganadores de sus distritos. Nosotros tenemos una representación proporcional que tiene sus ventajas y sus desventajas. Me gustaría saber si hubo alguna discusión respecto a introducir, no en el Senado, por la tradición del federal, de igualdad federal, sino en la Cámara de Diputados, alguna idea de representación proporcional para que sea más representativo de las minorías.
And the answer is we have nothing close to proportional representation. Ours is all single member districts. And as we say, first past the post, meaning in most places, the candidate who wins the most votes becomes the representative. Sometimes it's a majority is required. Other times it's just a plurality. We have talked a lot about trying to build in more proportional representation. And a part of the reason is that our system, with its laws and its traditions, fundamentally creates only a two-party system when it comes to who's going to have power. We have a handful of independents in our Senate, but otherwise it's all Democrats and Republicans. And increasingly, we have many voters who don't feel as if they have a home in either of those parties. And where you get an independent party emerging, it can be a spoiler. It can tilt the election one way or the other. We have a fear about that in the presidential contest. ahead. We could, without changing the Constitution, create more opportunities for proportional representation. We could, for example, have multi-member districts just by changing a law that required the single-member ones, which was enacted in 1967. We've talked a lot about enlarging the House, which was fundamentally set at 435 after it grew every 10 years as the population grew in 1910, officially in 1929. If we enlarged the House, 150 more members, say, you would have more opportunities to have other kinds of candidates emerge. If we brought in a form of ranked choice voting where you could give your preferences, select a vote for one individual, but have a second and a third choice, and then you'd have a runoff of sorts, we would have more opportunities for independent parties to at least participate. So far, we've had very small moves in those directions. And it's, you can, as we've seen in many political systems, Israel being a very good example, have too much proportional representation, where you have very minor fringe parties that then can develop an enormous amount of power. But having at least some proportionality where you are going to get minorities represented and where you're going to have a greater opportunity to have the views that people have reflected directly in your legislature, that's a good thing. We need to move in that direction, but we haven't.
Okay, thank you.
Ahora vamos a darle la palabra, disculpas, aquí a dos profesores porque los remotos que han levantado la mano les vamos a dar la palabra posteriormente. Así que Alfredo Ito lo primero y después Daniel Basile. Adelante.
Thank you. How easy is to challenge an incumbent if you are from the same party?
Te vas a enojar.
Más fuerte, de vuelta.
How easy is to challenge an incumbent if you come from the same party?
It's, if you are an incumbent, you usually have significant advantages. You have a greater ability to raise money, you have name recognition, but we're seeing more instances where incumbents are being challenged in primaries and sometimes beaten. And when they are, it's usually because they haven't been extreme enough. And I will give you one example that happened in just a couple of years ago. A Republican congressman from the state of Virginia, quite conservative, his name is Denver Riggleman, made what turned out for him to be a mistake, which is he officiated at a same-sex marriage and got challenged by a very extreme right-wing person because that was going against the philosophy of his party, and he lost. So I would say now every 2 years, we'll have 2 or 3 individuals who lose in primaries. Another one very famous who lost was Liz Cheney, the daughter of our former Vice President Dick Cheney, who is extremely conservative, but took on Donald Trump and argued for his impeachment. And she lost in a primary by a very large margin. It's still fairly rare, but it's happening more. But to tell you the truth, the bigger impact is not even those who lose in primaries, it's those who fear losing and so move towards the extreme to head off a challenge that would be draining to them in finances, would be a headache, and might result in a loss. So the simple reality that you could have these challenges has moved the two parties, and especially the Republican Party, further towards an extreme.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a Daniel Basile, presidente del Círculo de Legisladores. Adelante.
La pregunta mía es posiblemente un poco conflictiva. Me interesaría saber qué piensa el pueblo norteamericano con respecto a la cuota que pretende el sexo femenino, considerando que normalmente los legisladores antiguos hablaban de la idoneidad del ser humano, no del sexo.
¿Dejas agregar algo?
Aparece el
La diputada miembro del Círculo de Legisladores, mandato cumplido, Fernanda Ferrero, adelante.
Sí, no. Quería agregar a lo que dice el diputado Basile, que en todo caso, no todas las mujeres hemos estado de acuerdo con el cupo. Yo soy una de ellas, porque creo en lo valioso que pueden ser las personas. Ahora, si hay un país que tiene una representación de un 50% de mujeres, obviamente tiene que haber una representación femenina para que responda a la inquietud de ese grupo. Pero yo creo que eso tiene que ser por capacidades de cada uno.
Okay.
Para completar.
I certainly agree with that. Quotas would be not a good thing to have. What you hope will happen is that top quality people, whatever their gender, will feel an incentive, a desire, and have the capabilities to run for office, and that over time, because women are just as smart and capable in every respect as men, that you will have a representation that reflects all of that. We've had, though, all kinds of barriers in the past to women being able to run for higher office. But now that we've had women at almost the highest levels, not in the presidency, and, you know, let's be frank, Hillary Clinton lost very narrowly, but certainly we know from a lot of research, one of the reasons that she lost votes that she might have gotten, that another candidate might have gotten, was because she was a woman. There is still a significant amount of misogyny there, but we've had women at otherwise the highest levels. Some of our most capable governors, one being the governor of the state of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, are women. We had Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. We have a woman as Vice President of the United States. All of those things create encouragement for more women of capability to run. And as I said earlier, we're now starting to get women who can speak with great authority on issues of national security. And that creates more of a sense that women can do anything in the society and can move forward. And of course, now, especially when we have divisive issues like abortion being dominant ones in the society, the voices of women become even more significant in dealing with these divisive issues. But we're still far from having the kind of quality pool of candidates across the board that would reflect that. The same, of course, is true of minority groups as well, many minorities.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos una pregunta de una diputada nacional de Argentina. El nombre es Marcela Campagnoli, que está aquí acompañándonos. Le pregunta, dice que no le queda claro cómo acomodan los límites de cada distrito electoral. Es decir, cómo un distrito permite que otro distrito avance, o sea, que se corran esas líneas, ¿no? Después de esta pregunta vamos con Víctor Albures, de Guatemala.
So the states determine, and often through the state legislatures, determine the lines of districts. Now, there's supposed to be some constraints and limits on what they can do. With the Voting Rights Act, they can't act to reduce the representation of people of color and especially of African Americans. But states have found ways, and of course, part of the reason that they can do this is our Supreme Court has said that as close as possible, districts have to reflect equal population. We have these powerful computer programs now where you can create districts that are equal in population, but that distort the outcomes. They do that through a process often of packing one party's members into one district so that they win by 90%, but then they can diffuse the other districts where your party in the that's making these decisions can win with 55 or 60%. So you'll get more representation that way. And while you have tensions there, and we should have the ability of our courts to step in and say, no, that's going too far. That's partisan actions that are denying people the representation that they deserve. Our courts, our Supreme Court, has tended to stay out of that or allow some very bad things to happen. And that's also true of the way in which our state legislatures have their districts set by their own state legislatures. We have a sort of an aphorism that's used that in a republic, voters are supposed to select their representatives. Representatives are not supposed to select their voters. But increasingly, our representatives select their voters, and if they have a distorted majority, they can distort even more. And that's what we've seen happen, and it's a real blow against a representative democracy.
Norm, I want to thank you. I know there are others waiting to ask you questions, but we have another speaker who you know very, very well. And my friends here and at Zoom, please join me in thanking Norm Ornstein. What a marvelous presentation.
Thank you very much, and you do have great speakers ahead. Gene can answer all the questions I didn't.
Thank you very much, Norm. Gene, are you with us?
You set me up very well, Norm. Anyway,
I have to
nice
go.
to
I
see
can't
you.
hear Gene, but thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Norm.
Can you hear me, Brian, and other people?
We can hear you just fine. Can you hear me okay, Gene?
Yes, good. Okay, so I don't need to adjust my volume.
No, you sound beautiful. I'll do very brief introduction. I introduced everybody at the start, so it came out of my time, not yours. I said very nice things about you, but I want to say this. To really understand how our government works, you have to appreciate the incredibly important role of staff. Staff there's no possible way a member of Congress can do all the things they have to do. You need the staff to not only do a lot of the work, but they often provide continuity. They're sometimes there longer than we are. And plus, they can give pretty objective feedback. Jean has had a career as an elected official. She's then served on the staff of a very senior member of the United States Senate in a very important role on the Rules Committee. And she also has served in a foundation that funds efforts to promote an effective democracy. So she brings a wealth of background and information. And I am so delighted when I ask myself, you have to, if you're going to talk about the Congress, you have to have someone who could speak about the role of staff. And because I didn't serve in the Senate, I also wanted someone who could speak about the Senate. I'm delighted to have Jean with us. And Jean, please, thank you for joining us. And as you know, you will welcome your remarks and then have time for questions, which there'll be many of.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here with this very distinguished audience. I know many of you are yourselves elected officials or otherwise engaged in studying the political system. So I look forward to our discussion after my remarks. I just wanted to mention, in light of what Norm said about women and Congress, I did run for Congress 25 years ago, and I think there were about 15 women or 20 maybe in the House of Representatives at that time, and they're now about, I think, 130, if I'm not mistaken. So clearly my timing was a little off. I didn't win, but it was a great experience. As Brian said, I served over 20 years in Senate staff. I also spent 2 years as a chief of staff in the House of Representatives. And just fun fact, I was in charge of planning the inauguration for Barack Obama in 2013, which was a huge collaborative effort on the part of many different agencies of government and a lot of fun. As Norm mentioned, and Brian too, they've discussed many aspects of the history and the sort of the big picture of the structure of our constitutional system. And Brian asked me to talk specifically about the Senate. I think that Norm has sufficiently alarmed all of us that I don't need to do that. But I think that what underlies a lot of these larger concerns that Norm has raised, and sort of is not only the structure of our constitutional structure, which is almost impossible to change because it would require a constitutional amendment. And although we have, I think, the oldest constitution among democracies in the world, we don't have a very good system for changing it when circumstances dictate, particularly in an era like today of very intense partisan polarization, where it's very hard to move anything forward on the political level. But I think what I've seen too is that many of the rules and procedures in the Senate are poorly understood, and a lot of Americans, and perhaps even some of you, wonder, like, well, why can't the Senate just like pass something? Why can't they just do it? Or bills come out of the House, whether it's a majority Democrat or majority Republican House, and then they never get out of the Senate. And I think it's very hard for most people to comprehend why the Senate can't just do something. And unfortunately, many people are elected to the Senate thinking that as well. So I want to go a little bit more in the weeds after the very big picture view of our politics that I think you got from Norm and also from Brian. As has been mentioned, the Constitution does spell out several unique roles for the Senate that are different from the House, particularly approving treaties and certain high-level presidential appointments. And I'll talk later about the Supreme Court. That is a particularly, I think, concerning case of how the rules have changed the process and the outcome for our Supreme Court. As you probably know, bills to originate government spending typically start in the House before coming to the Senate. And both houses, of course, have to approve legislation before it goes to the president to sign and become law. An interesting historical fact was in the beginning, senators were not elected by the public as they are today. They were under the original Constitution before the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913. They were actually appointed by state legislatures. So their constituency wasn't the general public, it was the state legislatures. And that led to some interesting issues, but eventually, along with other reforms, political reforms that were enacted, they did become popularly elected. Another feature is the role of the vice president. And so we mostly have a separation of the three branches of government in our constitutional system, but the vice president is an officer of both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So not only vice president in the executive branch, but president of the Senate. And in the beginning of our country, the vice president was there pretty much all the time presiding when there was a vice president. The position was often vacant. But over time, that has become primarily a ceremonial role that's, for example, the vice president presides over the counting of the electoral votes every 4 years. And when there's expected to be a tie vote in the Senate, a 50-50 vote, the vice president will come and preside over the Senate and cast the tie-breaking vote. So there is that sort of unusual relationship in the Senate between the legislative and the executive branch. As Brian alluded to, as a former member of the House and the Senate are very different in other ways that go more to the heart of their day-to-day operations. They have distinct roles, of course, as I mentioned, but they also have very different cultures and procedures. And it's here with the procedures, which I was very involved in as a staff director of the Senate Rules Committee, that often help to determine, as I said, some undesirable outcomes. So some of the ways in which they're different are, first of all, decision-making. The House makes its decision by majority rule, and the Senate does not. So if you're in the majority party in the House, you pretty much can push through whatever you want as long as you can keep your caucus together. Now, that's problematic as well, but it's not as problematic as trying to get people from the other party to vote with you. The Senate, as was mentioned, of course, is 2 senators for every state. So it has a very different, it was mentioned about the disparity in size of the states. So I won't go back over that. Although I think this is really at the heart of a very, very significant threat to our democracy as this disparity grows larger. And we are not able to, we haven't found a way to moderate that. And a constitutional amendment, I think most people feel is out of the question at this time. But another key distinction between the House and the Senate is in the area of minority rights. So the flip side of majority rule is minority power. In the House, members of the minority party have very little power, either individually as rank and file members, or even as a party in the committees or on the floor. In the Senate, the minority party and individual members of the minority party have a lot of power. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Another big distinction, I think Brian alluded to this, the culture of the Senate is very different from the House. And I think this derives in part from the differences in their size, their composition, and their histories. So the Senate, with only 100 members, is much more intimate. I mean, it really has a sense of the Senate community. It's frayed a little bit, but that phrase, the Senate community, still has a lot of meaning to people, particularly those who spent many years working there. The House, of course, is so large that you don't even know all the members of your own party, much less other members of the House of Representatives. So it's also true that House and Senate staff members don't, in the House, the people from different parties, staff people don't really work together very much, maybe at the committee level a little bit, but not much. In the Senate, it's just normal that you know and work with people on the staff of other members from different parties. You have to, because of the thresholds, the supermajority thresholds in the Senate, which I'll get to in a moment. So it's closer knit. You know, the Senate definitely sees itself as sort of an elitist bulwark or barrier against hasty legislating. It sees itself as a place to seek consensus, to take time, and to assure that the interests of the states are not overwhelmed by what it likes to call, you know, populist passion, which they think the House is sometimes a victim of. There are longstanding rivalries. House members love to say that the Senate is a place where good legislation goes to die. And I will say that the Senate's attitude towards the House is sometimes a bit arrogant or even disparaging. So it's just the way it is. They don't talk a lot to each other. And there are these cultural differences. Another difference is the Senate legally has a more permanent status than the House. So the House is officially reconstituted every 2 years after the elections. But the Senate, since its members are elected every 6 years on a rotating basis, is considered to continue through every 2-year period, and its rules continue. So again, the House, whoever's in the majority after an election, creates the rules for that Congress, that 2-year Congress. Whereas in the Senate, the rules continue on. And frankly, it's very difficult to change them. It takes a 2/3 majority vote to change the rules. So there's a sense of more like stability and continuity, but also one might say lethargy. It's harder to change things just because you've come into the majority. Being in the majority in the Senate doesn't mean as much as it does in the House of Representatives. Another feature that I think is really important is this issue about individual member power, which I alluded to earlier. This is really crucially important, and it's a distinction between the two bodies. The senator has a lot of power individually. It's embedded in the Senate's fundamental parliamentary procedures and its rules. So in the Senate, routine business is conducted by what they call unanimous consent. So the presiding officer has a matter before the Senate floor, and he'll say, or she will say, without objection, it is so ordered. So if nobody objects, they just pass it. You know, they don't even vote on it half the time. It just goes through. But if a single senator, just one senator, objects, then everything grinds to a halt. And then you start the whole process potentially of either negotiating a solution to the senator's objection or going through the filibuster and cloture process, which I'll get to in a moment. One example of this is currently is that a senator from Alabama has put a so-called hold or an objection on over 200 nominations to the Defense Department from the president. Because why is he doing this? Well, he's doing this because it's the one pressure point he has to get what he wants. And what he wants is he wants the Defense Department to change its policy on providing funding for women who are pregnant, who are members of the military, to travel to a state where they can get an abortion. As you know, some of our states no longer allow abortions. So the Defense Department says, we're not changing this policy. It's a healthcare issue for our female soldiers. And this one senator from Alabama says, I don't care, I don't like it, you got to change this policy, or I'm not going to allow any of these promotions, any of these appointments in the Defense Department to go through. And this has now been a stalemate for several months. Negotiations are underway, but there's no way that the Senate could just decide, well, we're going to take up these nominations and vote on them, because every one of the 200 nominations would take probably at least a week or two to go through the filibuster and cloture process. So do the math, you know, it would take the rest of the year and into next year just to do these 200 appointments. And most of them are routine, like they're generals who are being appointed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and things like that. So all those positions are being filled by acting people until the appointments are finished. So, you know, you might say, well, why do the other senators put up with this? Why do they let these holds, which are hurting their own state, they're hurting people that they support from getting promoted? And the reason is really pretty simple. The reason they don't crack down on it is because every other senator wants that same power for herself or himself when they want to object to something and hold up the administration or hold up a bill or something. So they could get around it if they wanted to, but they don't want to erode that really, really crucial power that they have to completely gum up the works. I'm sorry, to completely block things. So I have a few more minutes. I want to say that this issue about the filibuster. So this is what the Senate has that the House does not have. It's sort of like the right of a senator to keep talking or to force everybody to keep talking. And the way to bring this debate to an end is the so-called rule called cloture, which means closing off debate. But in the Senate, the current rule is that if you want to end the debate, you have to have 60 votes to end the debate. Well, right now the Democrats have only 51 votes. Republicans have 49. So if this let's say they have the filibuster on the nominations and the Democrats want to end it, they can't. The majority party can't end the filibuster without having votes from the minority party, because you can't get to 60 from 51 without some of the 49 coming on board. So this is a real problem. And decades ago, the filibuster was very rarely used. It was primarily used to block civil rights legislation. But in the last 20 years, it has become used. It's being used very, very frequently. And it's become a major source of frustration, irritation. And I think it's undermining respect for the Senate and for our democracy, because these senators are seen as acting in their own interests and not necessarily the interests of the country as a whole. So I think that I will close just by reinforcing what, no, actually, I want to say something else about the judges before I go. So, I think in today's highly polarized environment in the United States, where both in the House and the Senate are closely divided between Democrats and Republicans, it's very hard to muster supermajorities. And this came to for cloture. So this came to a head about 10 years ago. I was actually very involved in this at the Senate Rules Committee when the Democrats were in the majority, but Republicans were blocking all of Senator Obama's nominations to the federal courts. We didn't have a Supreme Court nomination, but the appellate judges and so forth. And the Democrats saw that these judgeships were vacant. And not only was that bad for the judicial system, but they feared that when Republicans took over the Senate and the White House, that suddenly they'd fill all these with more conservative judges. So it was a long process. We had many hearings on this issue in our committee. And in 2013, the Democrats voted to eliminate the 60 vote threshold for all presidential nominations, judges, cabinet posts, etc., except for the Supreme Court. They felt the Supreme Court should still require a larger bipartisan supermajority to be confirmed. But as we know, that's not exactly what happened. So the Democrats did pretty quickly fill. They said it's just a majority vote. You don't need 60 votes, you just need 51. So they were able to pretty quickly put Obama's federal judges in place in the courts. And then in 2017, we had a Republican president, Mr. Trump, and we had a Republican Senate. So they voted, I won't go into the details. There's a specific, very arcane parliamentary maneuver that allowed both the Democrats and the Republicans to change the threshold from 60 to 51. Anyway, so the Republicans said, we're going to do this for the Supreme Court and get our Supreme Court judges. So they did that. We've had 3 Supreme Court vacancies during this time while the Republicans were in charge. And we've ended up with a very conservative Supreme Court, which I think many Americans feel is out of sync with the public as a whole. But it's the thing that has, when we look back historically, this change in the rule, so you can look at the big picture and say the Supreme Court has changed radically. But the thing that was really the pivot for it, coming out of our polarized politics, was the fact that this one little rule changed. And now in the past, presidents had to think about nominating people for public office in the judiciary and the executive branch who could get broad bipartisan support. So they had to pick people who were more moderate, not as extreme, because they could never get bipartisan support, supermajority support for these extreme candidates. That's no longer true. So the type of people who are being nominated by the presidents, in some cases, some presidents are more extreme. And as long as they can get the support of 51 senators, they will be confirmed. So this is what's happened on the Supreme Court. And it has really, I think, had a huge impact, not only on our judicial system, because they're also doing this at all the federal courts, the appellate level, the district level, and so forth. So you're having this huge pipeline, this huge infusion of extremely conservative judges who would never get popular broad support filling our judiciary. And then what's coming out of that, in some cases, are are considered by many people extreme decisions that are further, I think, further undermining our ability to compromise and to be a functional democracy. So this rules change has triggered outcomes and consequences that I think very few people foresaw. So in the past, when our political parties overlapped more in their ideologies, they weren't so distinct. It was easier for the Senate to function despite its supermajority rules and to broker compromises. And I think that often the Senate saw itself as being able to create legislation that would get broad acceptance from the public. It would sort of smooth off the rough edges of partisanship that would come out of the House of Representatives and generally be accepted. But today, the space for building consensus and finding compromise has narrowed dramatically. To me, it's really unclear, and I think obviously to Norm, and it's very worrisome whether the Senate today can adequately carry out its role of finding solutions that supersede and go beyond a party and that the public will broadly support. I'm happy to answer questions or have a conversation.
I think you summarized it so well. Thank you. The pattern that you hear from both Jean and Norm, and these are two people who love the institution of Congress. They've served it, they believe in it, they want to see it work, and they're very concerned about how the extremism, the empowerment of small minorities, Norm talked about the 30% of the senators, Jean's talking about one person being able to stop everything in the United States Senate, which can stop basically everything in the country, including our military readiness, the appointment of judges, etc. It's very difficult. Juan de Dios, Jean, you heard him take the earlier question. He'll call on people, and we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Muchísimas gracias, Brian. Un placer, Jean. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Tenemos preguntas. Bueno, tenemos a Víctor Albures. Adelante y luego hacemos una pregunta aquí en el piso.
Muchas gracias. Voy a construir, sigue vigente mi pregunta desde la presentación inaugural del congresista Baird, segundo del profesor Norman, y ahora con esta explicación de la profesora Jean. Los tres han hablado sobre esa representatividad del sistema actual en los Estados Unidos de América. Luego la preocupación, lo manifestaba el congresista Baird de cómo ahora se elige más por partido político que los miembros que llegan a ocupar los cargos tanto en las dos cámaras legislativas. La pregunta es, ¿cómo maneja hoy el sistema legislativo en Estados Unidos el tema de la disciplina partidaria? Si un solo representante puede tener una agenda legislativa, ¿cómo cabe esa función de la disciplina partidaria en los Estados Unidos?
Muchas gracias. Vamos a seguir con las otras preguntas para que las conteste juntas, mejor. Así que, ¿alguna pregunta aquí, por acá, por el piso?
And could I also say that the first question, I didn't get, I was trying to follow the Spanish and my English was off. So if you could also, the first one, I wasn't able to hear in English.
Yeah, the first question was basically about the discipline of the political parties inside the chambers. So how it's working, the discipline of the senators and congresspersons. That was the question.
Gene, I'll let you take it. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Otra pregunta, disculpen, aprovecho, ¿cómo reacciona la sociedad civil si se refleja esa polarización del Congreso en la sociedad civil y si hay algunas organizaciones que son lo suficientemente respetables y genuinas que puedan influir en lograr un Congreso un poco más moderado en cuanto a acercar a los republicanos con los demócratas? Esa es una segunda pregunta. Y una tercera tiene aquí Fernanda Bendinelli.
Ah, sí. Ella hablaba de un Senado, podríamos decir nosotros, corporativo, ¿no? 100 personas unidas que no dejan entrar mucho de afuera y que no tienen comunicación con the House, digamos, con los diputados. De ahí que mi pregunta es, esta élite, como de alguna manera Jim la denominó, es justamente la que impulsa a los senadores a la presidencia, porque no veo, o no conozco tal vez, diputados, o sea, quiero decir, members of the House, que sean impulsados hacia la presidencia. O sea, esta élite es la que domina de alguna manera la escena política.
Gene, please.
Any more?
Let's take those three. That's three big topics.
Okay, I think I understood them. If not, please correct me. So in terms of discipline in the Senate, it's, I think both the Senate and the House, there's a lot of discipline within what we call the caucuses. So like all the Democrats are in the Democratic caucus and some independents as well. And then the Republicans are in the Republican caucus. And they elect their own leader. So the majority leader in this case is a Democrat, my former boss, Senator Schumer, and he's the leader of the Democrats. And then the Republicans, each of them elect their own leader, and the minority leader in this case is Senator McConnell of the Republicans. So there is a lot of party discipline. I think one thing that none of us speakers so far have really addressed is the role of leadership in the House and the Senate and shaping the agenda and disciplining the members. So what we saw with Speaker Pelosi, for example, and I just reviewed a book about her speakership, so I read about a lot of this in depth, is that she was, and Brian, you would agree, very powerful speaker. She used all the tools at her advantage to keep her Democratic caucus in line. So very rarely did a significant number of her members vote with Republicans. If she didn't need their votes, that's one thing, but when she needed their votes to pass something, they were there. So there was that. In the Senate, similar phenomenon, which is to say, generally speaking, both Republicans and Democrats vote with their party. And that is reinforced again by the leadership. And in terms of, so there is a lot of party discipline, even though individual members. So here, for example, with the senator from Alabama who has this hold, excuse me, his leader, in this case, the Republican leader, could say, well, we're not going to honor your hold. We're going to support the Democrats. We're going to put these nominations through, and we're not going to filibuster them. We're just going to vote for them. They could do that, and they wouldn't go through this whole. But the leader And the caucus is supporting this one senator who wants to have his hold because the leader wants to have the support of his members. And if he doesn't support one of them, then the others are going to feel like he's abandoning them. So the leadership role is extremely important. I hope that answers that question. There is a lot of party discipline. Brian, you might want to add to that.
Well, I think that's right. I think the other thing that stands out for me, Gene, is the contrast you made so well. In the House, you can disagree with your party leadership, but it has minimal effect because you're one vote. In the Senate, if you disagree with your party leadership, you can have profound effect, and that's good and bad. There are a few things worse than being helpless, but one is wanting to do something important and having one person prevent you from doing it. So I think you've really touched on it well, Gene, in the House and the Senate, and in neither case, in the House, they may not need your vote, so they'll sometimes give you a political vote, but if you feel passionately about it, you can take a stand, but you often have little impact.
And you may pay a big price.
Oh, yes, I experienced that.
I would say, and this relates to another question, that the place where I think there is a significant amount of communication between the House and the Senate, it's not at the individual member level, or it's at the committee level. So I've worked, as I said, on the Senate committee, and I've worked in leadership. So, House and Senate, when they do want to pass legislation or get something done, the leaders are where that happens. So the leadership offices are the ones who get together and decide really when they have to do something jointly, like send a bill to the president. Similarly, committees have counterparts. So the Rules Committee, my counterpart in the House was the House Administration Committee. And I knew the people there, and it happens that they were Democrats when I was there as a Democrat. But, even if they'd been Republicans, we had to work together on our issues. So at the committee staff and member level and at the leadership level, there is a lot more communication, but that's not true, broadly speaking, at the rank, what we would call the rank and file. And so there's a little more than we implied, but it's a very small group of people. The second question was about, I think, elites and their role in, the last question was about elites and their role in determining who are the presidential candidates.
Let me interrupt. I think there's another question I'm going to ask you to answer, and it's because of your role with Hewlett. And sorry to interrupt, but you had such a unique role.
I realize we're out of time too. Yeah,
but I want to make sure you address this because it's a great segue to Brad as well. And it was the question of, if we look at the polarization, is there anyone in civic society, or are civic society organizations well enough respected to try to bridge that gap? And in my observation, there is desperate concern about the polarization and many civic society groups trying to find a way to find common ground. And you served in that capacity, both you lived it as a staff member in the Senate, but then you directed a program that does just that. Can you talk a little bit about how civic society is trying to get the institution to work better, more effectively? And that will be a great segue to Brad Fitch, who will then finish our speaking tonight.
Great. Okay. And I'll just say one line about, at this point, I don't think that elites in the House or the Senate play much of a role in determining who are going to be the candidates for president, or even who's running in the primaries. I think that their role has passed into the pages of history for us. As far as the civil society goes, yes, you're right, Brian. I had a very I was in a place where I worked for one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the United States, and we and other foundations back starting 10 years ago started trying to figure out how we could, as philanthropies, turn around this polarization that we saw more and more damaging our democracy. I can't say we had a lot of good answers, but we tried, and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars have been invested to try to build up nonprofit organizations and organizations that support Congress to build bridges in our society. So there's the bridge building, people trying to bring together Democrats and Republicans to better understand each other and find common ground. There's also work which Brad will talk about. We supported his organization over the years to try to reduce the rancor and the problems created by polarization within the institution of Congress, and focusing on helping members of Congress be better at their jobs and helping staff be better at their jobs and help them learn how to talk with people who are across the aisle from them. I think what I've seen in the last, I would say, 4 years is a radical increase in this kind of activity, new organizations, new civil society organizations. And a lot of them aren't going to make it because they can't get enough funding, but a lot of money is coming from the philanthropic sector. I don't think we found the solutions. And unfortunately, some of the philanthropic money is going to what I consider polarizing efforts. You know, they only support one sort of side or the other, but a lot is going to try to bring people together. I don't know if it's going to be effective because this money is being countered by billions and billions of highly partisan political money that's going into campaigns of all kinds, not just election campaigns, but issue campaigns and so forth. So it's really a battle for the soul, the minds, the hearts of Americans, and who are we and what do we want to be in the future. It's a very difficult moment, but people like Brad and Brian are doing a lot to try to change the way we are in the future.
And thank you so much for your time and for that insightful answer. That tension.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
That tension right now between those of us who want to see the system work and recognize the need for compromise, for finding common ground, for being respectful, for being fact-based, as Norm said, and people like you trying to support that, while others are spending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars saying, I want to elect people who will not compromise. I want to elect people who will take an extreme position. I want people who will not change based on new information. That's a real tension, and it goes back to a number of other variables and is exacerbated, made worse by some of our structural mechanisms in the way the Senate's built, the Electoral College is built, the Senate rules. Jean, thank you not only for being here tonight, but for your ongoing life of service and for your clear insights into the Senate and how it works or how it isn't working. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I have to say, I do feel some hope for the future because of what many people are doing. And Brad will talk, I'm sure, very optimistically because he already does. But there are a lot of good people in our system and many staff people who work every day along with their members to make things better. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Well, I'm going to introduce Brad Fitch. He's the head of a very unique organization called the Congressional Management Foundation. Its goal, as he'll tell you, is to try to help the Congress work better. I also want to say to all of the people who are on the screen, if we haven't asked your questions yet today, if we haven't answered them, we will have an entire session with former members of Congress on October 16th, I believe it is. So there we'll have 3 hours with members from both political parties, many of whom I know, and they're good people. They're coming to Argentina. They wanted to be here during the election, and they've dedicated. So we have about 6, I think, are coming if everybody makes it. And then you can ask many of these same questions, including Congresswoman about the elitism of the Senate running for there. But I knew of Jean's background, and I knew you'd be interested in that as well. So, Brad, without me taking more of your time, I just want to say the one thing I haven't said about Brad's book, when you're a new member of Congress, you have no idea what you're doing. Maybe you've served in the legislature, maybe you were a university president, maybe you were a business person. It's completely new. And there's a book, I wish I still had the copy with me, called the Setting Course, I think. My book had pages bent over. I had underlined things. I had highlighted things. It was like the guidebook for a person who was lost in the wilderness. And Brad Fitch and his organization publish that book every 2 years. They're the people who help us try to learn how to do a job that is impossible to do. We do it less badly than we otherwise would, thanks to Brad. Brad, please, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Congressman. One of the things that we do at my organization has over the last 3 years tried to help congressional offices manage themselves as they navigate some very unusual new situations, including the pandemic, including the attacks on January 6th. And two of the programs we did during that time featured Dr. Baird. The first one was in May of 2020 on how to manage stress in a congressional office during a crisis. And the general wisdom and conclusion of the former leaders at the Congressional Management Foundation and myself was that Dr. Baird's presentation was probably the best presentation we've ever had in the last 20 years, because as you know, he kind of flitted between the two worlds of psychology and politics, and over half the United States Congress in terms of their offices sent a representative to that webinar training program. We also did a training program after January 6th and the attack on the Capitol, which had the unfortunate title, How to Manage Congressional Staff While Under Attack. And he and another trainer, again, did another outstanding job. So I'm here for payback. I owe Dr. Baird because he's done a couple of great programs for my audiences. And as Dr. Baird said, the Congressional Management Foundation is a 47-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit organization that has 3 missions. We focus on optimizing congressional offices as these individual small businesses are, and that's what I'm going to concentrate my talk on here today. We try to work to revitalize Congress as an institution, working with those people inside and outside of Congress that are trying to strengthen it as a democratic institution. And we have this unusual role of also helping Americans interact with Congress. I know that many international systems don't have the equivalent of our civil society. We call them nonprofits or trade associations. They are very important players in society and in our interacting and building coalitions. And we work with their members, so teachers, food bank representatives, dermatologists, nurses, to help them have a greater voice and basically train them on how to be good advocates. So that's basically what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. It looked like I had that capability. And will warn you in advance, I'm a PowerPoint snob / fanatic and live and breathe and eat on PowerPoint. And so I'm going to share you today an insider view. It looks like it's not quite sharing yet. So let me sort of play with Zoom here for a second. What I'm going to concentrate on is the operational components of an individual congressional office. I know in working with international legislatures that it's very rare to have a size of the staff that the United States Congress has in terms of the support that they get. And as you'll see, that every House member has 16 to 17 staff members that they work with on a regular basis. The United States Senate, an individual senator from a large state, because it's apportioned, their budgets are apportioned by their population. A senator can have up to 100 staff members. So these are small businesses that they have to run. And as Dr. Baird said, the reason that my organization was brought into existence in 1977 is because they may be good political communicators or they may be good politicians, but they weren't very good managers. They didn't know how to do performance reviews or create a strategic plan. And so that's where my organization comes in. It looks like the screen is sharing now, so I'll go ahead and proceed. So today, what I'm going to talk about 2 things, basically. What is it to be a member of Congress, down to literally what is their job description and how do they spend their time, and a little bit more about the individual congressional offices that make up the United States House and Senate. I'll be focusing most of my attention on what are called the personal offices, not the committee offices or institutional offices. Okay, with that, let's talk a little bit about members of Congress. One of the things that, and aspects of my job that is unusual, is I have a front row seat, sometimes even a behind the curtain scene of what goes on in Congress. And as Gene alluded to, I am more optimistic than most, because most members of Congress I work with are really decent people that are just trapped in a rather dysfunctional system. Now, I'm not saying that they're all saints, and I know that the occasional criminal or idiot is elected in our American system, and they get on television a lot more than the people that are actually doing the jobs. And you know what? As an historian, I would tell you that happened in the 1940s, the 1970s, the 1980s. I could totally give you a list of members of Congress that were as crazy or crazier than certain people that are currently, but they didn't have Twitter in 1975. And so they're able to amplify their voice much greater. And I recognize that in America, many people are very cynical about our system. Here's a statistic that was taken in a national poll of American voters. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Do most members of Congress care what their constituents think? And only 11% of Americans would believe that Congress cares what constituents think. This is a really terrible statistic in our democracy, because the fundamental principle upon which our democracy was founded was a representative body that genuinely did represent at least the views or aspirations of their constituents. But I know from working with them that they actually do care what they think. We did a survey of actual members of the U.S. House of Representatives and asked them to rank the most important aspects of their job. And 95% said staying in touch with constituents. And frankly, a lot of them are a lot more like Dr. Baird and Congressman Baird. They really do realize, both for moral reasons and for political reasons, that they have to stay in touch with their constituents. Now, let me talk a little bit about their work and what they actually do. In our survey of congressional members, we actually asked them how many hours a week they work. And our survey and our independent research shows that the average work week for a member of the House when they're in session is 70 hours a week. And I know Dr. Baird will probably reaffirm that because that was his schedule, I'm sure, when he was in session. The average number of meetings they have on a daily basis is 13 meetings a day. The day usually goes from around 8 a.m. to around 8 or 9 p.m. When we work with first-term members of Congress in their first year in office, the biggest complaints we get is they're not sleeping enough, they're not eating right, and they're not exercising. And usually by about June, something's happened and they realize they can't keep up this pace. Here's a sample schedule. I'm going to walk through a little bit of what a member of Congress would do on a regular basis on dates. So they might start off with a speech to a trade association. Remember, I talked about these associations. They often have meetings in Washington where they convene people from all over the country who care about certain issues. And in this case, this member of Congress, this is a real schedule, by the way, had a speech to the National Women, Infants, and Children's Association. Then they would have a committee hearing, this one related to agriculture. Notice that between 10 and 12, they're double booked. They also have a bipartisan classified briefing. Members are often double or triple booked. This is done for a couple of reasons. One, it gives the member of Congress flexibility to go to whichever meeting they want to go to. Second, it offers the opportunity for them to basically go to both of them. As you can see, midday, they would have a meeting with their colleagues. This is often twice a week. They would either try to meet with their colleagues or once a week. Then you start seeing in the afternoon the meetings that happen with other representatives of people coming from their local community. So these are people who have traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with them. And the afternoon would be very similar, where they're spending a lot of time just meeting with other people. Now, you notice there's call time here. One of the things you're going to learn that is a little bit surprising to you is that there is a myth that members of Congress spend a lot of their time raising money. Our research shows that is not true for the vast majority of members of the House and Senate. Now, if they are running for a tight reelection, or they're running for the Senate, or they're a committee chair or leadership, yes, they'll spend more time raising money. But that's only about 5 to 7% of the members of Congress. 93%, 95% don't spend their time raising money in the way you think. And I've got lots of documentation to back that up. But the myth still exists because the media likes to portray them as just money grubbing. Now, the other thing that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is members of Congress no longer move their families to Washington, D.C. They continue to keep their families home. They may do it for personal reasons or political reasons because they're making a decision on where they want their children to grow up. But what this means is when we asked how many weekends in a year they travel back home, as you can see, 78% said more than 40. So there's a lot of travel going back and forth for members of Congress every weekend, usually they're going back to their home districts. The schedule has gotten a lot more secure and knowable. Pre-2011, there was always some variables at the end of the week on whether there would be votes or not. That's no longer the case. When the Republicans took over in 2011, and then when the Democrats took back over in 2017, they now have much more set schedules in the House of Representatives. The Senate, as Gene alluded to, since senators can do almost anything they want, that's a different story. They don't have as much surety in their schedules. Now, let me go back to this survey of members of the House of Representatives and how they spend their time. So we asked them specifically when they're in Washington, this is the button blue, what do they spend most of their time doing? And as you can see, the plurality of their time is on legislative activities. Now, they do still spend 17% of their time on political or campaign activities. They will often go to other colleagues' fundraisers and spend time there. When they're back at home, and this is in red, the plurality of their time is interacting with constituents. So this is an accurate view of how members spend their time. It's not the prevailing view of what's portrayed in the movies or that's portrayed by the national media. And in fact, I worked with one national media reporter and gave them this data, and they ignored it, and they went with anecdotal data that was inaccurate. But don't get me started. I used to be a press secretary, so I've got a lot of opinions on reporters. All right, let me talk a little bit about the congressional office. As I said, a congressional office is very different than in many legislatures in that you have a staff that supports various activities. And I got a great quote from a book I read some years ago from the great Senator Ted Kennedy, who was in office for 47 years, from the 1960s to 2009. And this was the period of time that saw a big growth in congressional offices. In 1962, a House member would have had maybe 6 or 7 staff members supporting them. By 1977, that had grown to 16. And Senator Kennedy, I can tell you, he had over 100 because he was a committee chairman and a subcommittee chairman. And the reason I know how big his staff was is my office had a softball team, and whenever we had to play against them, it was impossible to win because he had so many good interns to pick from because he had such a big staff. We always lost to him because, he had such a big staff. One of the quotes that he gave was really wonderful. 95% of the nitty-gritty work of drafting bills and negotiating their final form is now done by staff. That marks an enormous shift in responsibility over the past 40 or 50 years. As I said, there was a big growth between 1964 and 1978 in congressional staff. This is where things average right now. In the Washington office, a House member will usually have about 8 staff, 6 or 7 in the district or state. In the Senate, the range is significant. The senator with the smallest state will have the smallest budget and may have 30 people. The senator with the largest state, California, New York, will have 100, and that doesn't include their committee and their subcommittee staff. This is the various roles that they play, and I'll just talk a little bit about each one of these. The chief of staff is the top manager of the office. Now, in the Senate, it's a little different. Chiefs of staff in the Senate, keep in mind, there's only 100 of them, have really evolved to be deputy senators. They negotiate on their own, they cut deals, they interact with other chiefs of staff. They also then have a senior manager in the state called a district director or state director. The legislative director, as you would imagine, is the person that helps usher through the agenda, the bills and laws that the lawmaker wants to pass. The legislative assistant is the policy expert. And in the House of Representatives, that expert may have to cover 7 or 8 different issues. In the Senate, if you have a big enough staff, you may only cover 2 issues. If you're Senator Schumer from New York, you may have a legislative policy advisor on taxes, and that's all they do. Caseworker is a term used in the United States Congress for a ombudsman or ombudswoman, someone who will work on behalf of constituents as their advocate before the executive branch. Let me give you a couple of examples. If, for example, and this just happened to a friend of mine, they needed to get their passport renewed because they forgot to do it, and they've got an international trip coming up, they can call their congressional office and they will help facilitate and expedite that passport. Immigration is the #1 issue. If someone has a visa that's expiring, they can go to their congressional office. Sometimes they can help, sometimes they cannot. If someone has, let's say, is on government assistance and there was a problem with the check, it got lost in the mail, they can go to their member of Congress and ask them support. They're really angels. These people are hardworking. Most of them are women. Most of them are older, and they're really terrific. They do have communications staff now. That's called a communications director, press secretary, or digital director. The most important job in Congress isn't the chief of staff. It's the scheduler. I've worked with offices that have had mediocre or weak chiefs of staff, and they've limped along just fine. If they have a bad scheduler, it's like having an air traffic controller that's drunk or doesn't know what they're doing, and there are plane crashes. The staff assistant is one of the most junior positions. It also has the highest turnover. They answer the phone. They help with the mail. They may supervise interns. The legislative correspondent is a term used for a person that does manage the mail. And you'll see in a minute, mail is a big part, meaning email mostly now coming in. The office manager, as the term implies, runs the office, everything from the budget to ordering supplies. And then there is an IT systems operator that works with the information technology. Now, I mentioned mail because, again, one of the things that changed in the last 20 years has been the influx of constituent communications, and the internet changed the economics of advocacy. We estimate that when the internet grew from 2002 to 2010, that every congressional office saw anywhere from a 200% to 1,000% increase in constituent communications. And these are just from constituents. The average annual number coming into a House office is 60,000. Keep in mind, there are 3 people answering that, 60,000. The office that gets the most mail gets about 150,000 emails from their constituents a year. Now, I mentioned before this trade association and nonprofit system we have. 90% of these communications are facilitated by these associations and nonprofits. So they'll send an email, and you may have a similar system in Argentina. They'll send an email to one of their members and say, please contact your member of Congress and ask them to increase funding for Alzheimer's research or for cancer research. And they will forward that message to that congressional office. And that's what the influx is. We estimate that Congress gets about 50 million emails from constituents on an annual basis. And let me wrap up before I go to questions and just talk a little bit about how they interact with citizens, because I've got some data that, again, supports the idea that they are listening to their constituents. We've been surveying congressional staff for all of our existence. And for the last 20 years, we've been asking this question. If your member or senator has not arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies directed to the Washington office have on his or her decision? And what we found is that in-person visits from constituents and contacts from a constituent's representative are the #1 things. Now, you may ask yourself, well, if constituents are so important, why do we see all these news stories about special interest groups? And why are they always yelling at each other? And the reason is because the vast majority of issues that Congress deals with individually as individual members are not the controversial issues of the day, which are immigration, abortion, and gun control. Most of the issues are funding battles over which research project is going to get funded, or whether or not students get extra aid. And because of that, members of Congress have a lot more flexibility to make decisions to support or oppose research funding or aid to students. Now, the last survey we did, and this is the last slide I'm going to share with you, we did a survey during the middle of the pandemic, and we wanted to know the influence of virtual meetings and find out whether they were the same. And what we found is that virtual meetings are almost as influential as in-person meetings. And you will talk to many congressional offices, and they now have as many still virtual meetings as they had during the pandemic. They're now bringing back to in-person meetings as well. With that, with the rest of the time I have available, and I'll let Dr. Baird cut me off whenever is appropriate, I'll be happy to take questions.
Brad, thanks. That inside view of what happens is really good. You're absolutely right about the scheduler, Brad. Your life is in the control of a scheduler. They tell you where to move. You follow orders. Your staff gives you directions. Brad, I'm going to take the liberty. Can you give what's so important about the work you do is imagine you're a new member of Congress. Maybe you've never served in the state legislature or the county commission. Completely. Maybe you were a doctor, a practicing attorney, a business person. You don't know the institution. You don't know the demands. You don't know the code of ethics. You don't know the technical skills. How do you hire staff who know how to respond to emails, for example? How do you have a good program? Can you give just a couple examples, and then we'll open it to questions? A couple of examples of where you have helped staff and the member learn valuable skills that will make them function more effectively in their service of their constituents, not their political job, not getting reelected, but just doing their elected job. Can you give a couple examples?
Sure. Our general rule, we coach people, and I work with an office, a freshman office that probably did better than anyone I've ever seen. We call it the 1/3 rule. You want to hire 1/3 of your staff of people that have worked in the United States Congress. Research done by the Center for Effective Lawmaking on freshman lawmakers showed that having an experienced legislative director will make you more effective. I know that sounds intuitive, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't do that. 1/3 you probably want to bring from your campaign staff. They've worked with you for now a couple of years. They know you. They're familiar with you. And then it's usually good to have a couple of people that may have worked with the lawmaker in another setting. Perhaps they worked in the private sector together. They've known them for a long time. We don't encourage them to hire like old friends. We have a saying, at many organizations do, but in politics, it's very important. Don't hire someone you can't fire. So don't hire the local mayor's kids. Don't hire your contributor's sons. You know, I worked with an office. I couldn't believe it. It was a terrific office, but they made one mistake. They literally did hire the son, the daughter of the biggest mayor in the district, and she was terrible, and they couldn't fire her for 2 years. It was a disaster. So we generally try to coach them to hire experienced people that know a little bit about the system.
Excellent response. I made that mistake, Brad. I hired the daughter of a prominent state legislator. It did not work out. And he spent much of his time on the floor of the state legislature telling everyone what a bad member of Congress I was. And of course, I was defenseless because I couldn't respond about how inadequate his daughter was. Juan de Dios, questions.
Bueno, hacemos una pregunta aquí en el piso y otra de afuera. Aprovecho en el medio, ahí lo tenemos a Santiago Traini, pero para agradecerle mucho a Brad Fitch, que estuvo en la Argentina el año pasado, en abril, en el primer taller de académicos y parlamentarios que organizamos en Villa Langostura. Lamentablemente eran 40 paneles con más o menos 100 expositores. Espero que hayamos podido prestarle la atención debida, pero demasiado grande el evento para atenderlos a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, Brad. Santiago Traini, por favor. Adelante.
Yes, I can.
Hello, thanks. My question goes towards have you ever been able to train or coach staff members of Congress from other country, and what's the difference between that and former members of Congress from the United States in comparison to those of other countries?
Okay. Could you repeat the first question? I missed it, my interpretation mark. Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh my gosh. So Iraq, Moldova, Mexico, Canada, EU, Nigeria. I spent a week in Nigeria. That was really interesting. So two things come through. One, they are astounded, first of all, at the size of the staff. And they're like, what do they do? You know, how do they keep busy? They are skeptical that the members are not corrupt and do not take their own budgets and spend them on families, especially in countries when I'm working with that have, frankly, corrupt systems. I mean, Nigeria and Iraq, those politicians would not believe me that I said, no, you can't spend money on your daughter. It's all the dollars are tracked. Congress is the most transparent institution financially on the planet Earth. Every single dollar that they spend is in a public record. And you know exactly where it went, who it went to, how much they spent. So that's one of the things that we find that is kind of hard to communicate. But generally speaking, what I find in common is most elected officials are good-hearted people. They're good public servants. And I had the opportunity to work with some of them last year when I went down to a conference in Patagonia. And I was just amazed and impressed because I didn't see a lot of significant difference in what motivates public officials, whether they're from, Buenos Aires or they're from Baltimore, Maryland.
Ok. Tenemos aquí, bueno, primero bienvenido Rojo Edwards, que es un senador de Chile, que veo que está aquí entre muchos otros. Lo tenemos por favor, adelante Daniel Basile, el presidente del FMC de Argentina. Adelante.
En primer lugar, agradecerle la información que nos ha brindado. Y la pregunta, porque todos estos temas, si los toma el periodismo de Argentina, usted no la va a pasar bien. ¿Podría decirnos cuál es el porcentaje que se invierte en el poder legislativo del presupuesto de Estados Unidos?
Could you clarify the percentage of invested in legislative power?
Yeah, exactly.
Budget.
From the national budget.
Poder legislativo.
Yeah.
Very, very small. Less than 0.5%. And in fact, they cut their budget significantly from 2010 to 2020. Now, in part because of the work that me and other organizations have done with a reform committee working in the Congress, those cuts have been restored as of 2021. But there's still always a pressure political for Congress to cut its own budget. It makes no sense. And it really doesn't really save much money, but they're politicians, right? And they want to look frugal to their constituents. And so they often will say, I don't spend money on my own budget and things like that.
Let me add to that, Brad. Each member in the House, and I think it's true in the Senate, gets a certain budget and they can spend that. It depends on where they live. If, like, I flew all the way across the country, so I had more. So you get some adjustments, but it's a fixed budget and you can manage it. You have a maximum number of staff you can have. As we'll see later on in my presentation, the complexity of the issues you have to deal with is astonishing. And you have some members of Congress, I could have used 20 more staff easily because of the issues I was trying to address, important issues. But there are some members who say, I give most of my money back. I only need 9 staff members. If that's true, you're not doing your job, in my judgment. And as you were saying, Congressman, that the percentage of the federal budget that goes to our staff, and by the way, our staff are paid very little. Many of the staff live together, 3 or 4 staffers sharing apartments. They get paid very little to work 70-hour weeks, to be criticized by the public, to try to save the country. It's that kind of a job, and we're so grateful for it. And Brad's team helps them do that. But it's a microscopic amount of money goes directly to our staff relative to the federal budget.
Gracias, Brian. Tenemos una pregunta de Mercedes Piscitello, que es la secretaria parlamentaria del bloque más grande de la oposición, que es del PRO. Adelante, Mercedes.
Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por todas las explicaciones que son muy ricas. Yo tengo una pregunta respecto al personal de los despachos. En 2018 tuve la posibilidad de hacer un intercambio y estar en Washington, D.C. con algunos empleados de los despachos, y ellos hacían hincapié en que no hay que hay una diferencia separación de tareas en lo que tiene que ver con lo partidario, ¿no? Con el hecho de las tareas políticas partidarias y su tarea legislativa. Incluso hay un comité de ética al cual estarían sometidos. En la experiencia de nuestro expositor, en el armado de despachos, ¿ve que esto continúa o qué tanto hay de lo partidario adentro de los despachos también? Muchísimas gracias.
Brad?
Well, thank you for pointing that out. And again, that's one of the myths or lies that is often told, that the policy staff get involved in the campaigns. And as you pointed out, there are very strict laws in America that prohibit that from happening. Both there are ethics rules that they have to adhere to, and there's laws. And if somebody breaks those laws, they'll end up paying for it. As I like to joke, you know, politicians are very good politicians, but they're pretty lousy criminals. And when they do break the law, they generally do get caught. And so you can't, for example, if I was working in the Congress, force a member of my staff to work on the campaign. That would be illegal. And I don't want to say who, but there are a couple members who lost their jobs because they did that. It doesn't happen often because it's really easy to get caught. And so they do separate that out. Additionally, when constituents are meeting with their lawmakers and asking them to do an official act, it is illegal for them to reference campaign contributions or campaign work. And most members of Congress, if you do that, if you go into a government office building in Washington, D.C. and meet with a member of Congress and you talk to them about the campaign contributions and then say, and tie it to a policy, they'll throw you out of the office. Because they know they may be afraid that they're being recorded, they're being set up, or they just don't like it. They think it's offensive. And so that is something that's pretty strict. Now, I'm not naive, and I do know, and the research does show, that people who contribute to political campaigns in America are more likely to get their voice heard than the average citizen. That is true. But political scientists in America have given up on trying to correlate campaign contributions and legislative outcomes because it just doesn't correlate. It doesn't exist.
Brian, por ahí tenemos al doctor Raúl Martínez Pita, que tiene una pregunta que creo que está relacionada en general a lo que se ha dicho antes.
Perdón, no estaba preparado. ¿Es la que escribí yo antes?
Sí.
Bueno, la tendría que leer, pero me parece que hablaba si existían hoy en día esa práctica de utilizar el bloqueo de un proyecto a través del filibusterismo. Y si actualmente se hace.
Y si un proyecto que finalmente no se trata puede volver a ingresarse.
Ah, perdón, esa te la hice. Okay.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
So basically, if it still is it's happening in the United States, in the Congress, the filibusterism.
Oh, the filibuster. Yeah, sure. The reason that one member of the Senate is blocking 250 military officers' career goals. They've worked their whole life to be a colonel, major, and the president has to approve higher ranking appointments. And he's holding up, and the Senate has to approve that. He's holding all of those up for one issue. That's the filibuster. It applies to basically everything in the Senate except judges. So it's still an enormous problem in the Senate. And it still applies to Supreme Court justice. Well, it did to Supreme Court justice, not anymore. So,
correcto. Y si ese proyecto es rechazado,
is it being rejected? That
yes.
But the problem is, as Gene was saying, first of all, it is not in the Constitution. The filibuster is nowhere in the Constitution. The Senate made those rules. They invented that rule. They can change it tomorrow if they want. But to change the rule, okay, you have to beat the filibuster, right? So you could filibuster. The filibuster is self-protecting in a way. Does that make sense? So and the crazy thing is, each senator wants to feel they're God. This is the elite question that the congresswoman, it really is true. They want to feel they're super important. Members of the House, we know that we have 5 minutes to speak. We have to sit down and shut up. Senators, they can talk for 5 days if they want. They don't have to say anything. So they don't want to give up that incredible power, and the power works for them. It doesn't work for the country. So many people want to get rid of the filibuster. In my book, I say we should get rid of the filibuster because, by the way, it was used for many years, as Brad knows well, and as Gene and Norm pointed out, to defend racism. So efforts to try to reduce racism in the South were blocked by Southern senators resisting voting rights for Black people. So it has a bad history as well.
I'm going to take an unusual and contrarian view here.
Please.
Because I actually do believe that with the proper reforms, we do need the filibuster. And let me explain why. Our system of government was designed to be a collaborative government of checks and balances. We're not a parliament. It was not designed to have a simple majority rule. And the filibuster is part of a legacy that allows that system to work. Put another way, in January of 2017, if we didn't have the filibuster, Donald Trump would have been able to ban people from entering this country based on their religion. The filibuster is what protected Muslims from not being banned. Abortion would have been banned nationally in 2017. So many bad things happen if you have one party controlling the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And I'm saying that as a nonpartisan independent. There's a reason why our system of government is set up for people to collaborate. Now, as we can see, bad actors, and we've talked about this one senator, can exist and can throw a lot of problems, sand into the gears and grind it to a halt. And I'm very hopeful that we'll come to some sort of compromise here. But, you know, just to remind people that we've actually seen a lot of compromise work in the last decade. Every single budget that was passed by the Congress since 2011 was passed with vast bipartisan majorities. We've tackled a lot of difficult problems. The bill we passed that increased infrastructure spending a couple of years ago with a strong bipartisan majority in the United States Senate. So there's lots of examples of where bipartisanship works. It doesn't get the media coverage. It doesn't get the attention. And that is a significant, in my opinion, the problem in part is because of the way the institution is portrayed. And it's as much of a problem as the actual dysfunction of the institution. I'm not saying it's functioning well, and I'm working with others as Dr. Baird and other groups to improve it. But if we get rid of the filibuster, America, I believe the democratic experiment will start to crumble because we'll just turn into a majoritarian democracy, and that is not what our founders intended, and that's not what's worked for 270 years.
I actually see it exact opposite. Brad made some good points about some bills that would have passed or would not have passed were not for the filibuster. But right now, the minority impact, a few people blocking many federal judgeships, blocking many appointments to military, et cetera, is really creating a huge problem on the ground. And when that happens, people lose faith in their government. If you can't get a court hearing because there's not a judge to hear the case, if you can't get a budget for a federal agency, you know, when the federal budget gets held up, as is likely to happen, all the federal agencies have to stop their work, or they can't plan. They can't sign a contract to repair a road in a national park, et cetera. So when a minority group, I don't mean ethnic minority, I mean a political, ideological minority, can hold the entire institution hostage, that's a problem. And that doesn't promote bipartisanship. Bipartisanship, I'm all for. That promotes extremist control at the expense of the many. And that's a challenge. That's, I think, what. But it's good. You raise a good point, Brad. Let's do one last question and then.
Ahí está la diputada Graciela Camaño, de Argentina, que es joven, pero tiene bastante experiencia en el Congreso argentino. Graciela Camaño pregunta básicamente cómo funciona la diferencia entre los empleados que son de planta permanente, es decir, que pertenecen al Congreso de los Estados Unidos o a alguna de sus cámaras, de los que son transitorios, y cómo es esa proporción, cómo es la proporción entre unos y otros.
Great question. So what we call those staffers that you would call permanent, we call them institutional staffers. So they provide the support of the infrastructure, and that represents about half of the legislative branch employees. And they include the following. They might include floor staff who operate the floors of the House and Senate. They may be in the legal profession. They work the actual bills themselves when they're drafted are drafted by lawyers who may work in council offices. There are a number of research institutions that support the Congress, like the Congressional Research Service and the Library of Congress and the Government Accountability Office. Those are the institutional offices of the United States Congress, and they represent about half. there's about 30,000 total employees that work in the legislative branch. 15,000 are institutional, and 15,000 are selected by the members of Congress themselves to serve in their personal offices or in their committee offices. Now, I should point out, in the committee offices, they are appointed by the chair of the leading Democrat and the leading Republican. They get to hire all the people. So one of the most powerful committees we have in the Congress is the Ways and Means Committee. That's the tax writing committee. And that one chairman hires 300 people to work at the Ways and Means Committee to write the tax law in the United States.
Muchas gracias, excelente.
Brad, thank you, my friend, for your work that you do, and thank you for taking your time to join us today and for all the work you do to share this model and the insights you gain across the country. I really am grateful for your time and for that of Gene. And I've got about 10 more minutes left today. So I'm going to let you go. If you want, Brad, you're welcome to sit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you very much, Brian. Take care.
Thank you. See you down here sometime. Please come visit. So before I do a few closing remarks, I want to make, first of all, next week we have two more amazing speakers. The United States Ambassador to Argentina, Mark Stanley, will be leading off with an hour presentation just to our group. It's not open to the general public, but Mark Stanley will be here. And then later that day, my very, very dear friend, Bob Mary, who's a distinguished presidential scholar, wrote the leading biographies on President Polk. President McKinley he's just finishing work on the buildup to the Civil War and by two signature states, how you could just see the train wreck happening. He's working on that. And he wrote a book called Where They Stand, in which he endeavored to rank all of the presidents of the United States in terms of their significance as leaders of our country. And so he's a great speaker as well. I prepared a much longer PowerPoint for today, but we had fantastic speakers. So I'm not going to endeavor to do that. See some of the themes that our friend Brad Fitch and Norm and Gene shared, the life of a member of Congress. Mine was busier by far, actually, than what Brad's portrayal was. It was interesting, too. There's a huge difference, as I've described before, between someone from a swing congressional district, which mine was. It had been held by a Democrat first, then a Republican, then me, and then it went to another Republican after I retired. But it was always a battle. And I spent incredible amounts of time meeting constituents, raising money, etc. And it's a full micro, like 12-point font description of my days in the Congress and my days in the district, and some thoughts I've shared about qualities that not just that make a member of Congress, but how members of Congress can be effective. You might find those interesting. The PowerPoint version is available and a PDF version. So please, thank you. I don't want to pick up the PowerPoint at this point. We've had a wonderful night. Great questions from the audience. I'm always sorry that we don't have more time with these talented speakers.
No podemos aprovechar una o dos preguntas más.
Okay, we'll do one or two because we have 5 more minutes.
Okay, podemos aprovechar para hacerle alguna pregunta, que es un placer tenerlo.
I'm not going to start the PowerPoint.
Brian Baird. No, una pregunta hay una preocupación muy grande en los Estados Unidos por la sociedad civil, pero dentro del propio Congreso, ver con la percepción de la comunidad, de la sociedad en general, del pueblo estadounidense, de que la democracia no está funcionando. Y focalizado en el Congreso. Se habla de cómo introducir innovaciones en el Congreso. No es solamente una crítica a cómo se pensó por los padres fundadores, sino una crítica por también la actualidad, lo que ha ocurrido con muchos fenómenos como el de la tecnología. La pregunta es, ahí se ve que revisan algunos, por ejemplo, los town halls. Entonces, por ejemplo, respecto a los town halls, que es algo viejo, tradicional, para muchos no está funcionando porque son lugares hasta peligrosos para un congresista. Bueno, en definitiva, y después está todo lo moderno que tiene que ver con el uso de las tecnologías para que la gente participe en el proceso de formación de las leyes, en el control parlamentario, en el presupuesto. Bueno, todo ese paquete, ¿cómo están lidiando en los Estados Unidos?
You know, I've had the opportunity here to ride in many cabs. And so I have the cab test. I asked the cab drivers here in Argentina,
Yes.
What do you think about the elections? I think every single cab driver has said, we've given up on our government, which is heartbreaking. I know how hard you work. I have a sense of what good people you are. The same thing if you ask cab drivers at home in my country, similar attitude. The trust level for Congress is very low, very, very low. They have no idea how hard members work, how important the job is, how complicated it is. There's a slide, actually a series of 6 or 7 slides that I have in my PowerPoint about the jurisdiction of the Commerce Committee of the Congress. What are the issues it controls? And I'm going to share those with you. It's this one committee, one subcommittee: pharmaceuticals, international trade, high technology, homeland security, environmental protection laws, et cetera, and on it goes. Any one of those could take your entire life to study. One committee has all those things, and you're very likely to have 1 or 2 staffers plus yourself. The problem is the public doesn't have a sense of how hard the job is, how complex the issues are. So the public doesn't know what the Congress is doing. Secondly, though, structurally, the Congress is not well defined and structured to deal with these. So even if you're hardworking, super bright, great staff, devote 26 hours of your day to the job, you still are limited in what you can do. So there is an effort to try to improve it. There's a committee called the Committee on Modernization of the Congress. Someone once said the Congress is an 18th century institution trying to solve 21st century problems with 19th century technology. We don't have, if you go into our Congress, I was in the legislative office in Buenos Aires in the city, everyone had computers on their desk. You can't have a computer on your desk in the House and Senate. We're that far backwards. There was a big argument, and Juan and I worked together on this issue of can Congress meet remotely? When COVID first started, Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, said, we'll never meet remotely. I, with the former members who will be joining us in a few weeks, created the first remote virtual congressional hearing. It wasn't real. It was used former members to show that it could be done. So there are efforts, Juan, to try to improve responsiveness. The other problem, though, is it is so easy for critics to find the mistakes members of Congress make, or to pick a few members of Congress who do irresponsible things, or to make fun of, and by late night comics to make fun. To be cynical is easy. To be critical, to be constructive, to work hard, to find solutions, to take criticism, that's not easy. So, but we have the same problem, a large lack of trust. I had 350 times in a 12-year period, I had a town hall, which meant I would appear at a place like this. Anyone who wanted to could ask me any question they wanted, anything. They were safe, they were informal, they were respectful. In my last 2 years in office, we began to receive death threats. People began to post online how to interrupt town halls with specific recommendations. Whenever Congress tries to speak, shout them down, interrupt them, call them a liar. It doesn't matter what they say. Call them a liar. Do not let them have intelligent discussions. How big was this? In my last year in Congress, when the healthcare bill, to try to provide healthcare for more than 14 million of Americans who had no health insurance, wasn't a perfect bill, but it was a good try at a big problem. We had such a problem with the safety at our town halls that I actually had armed police officers there to protect me with plainclothes, with whatever. And at one town hall, we held it in a rock amphitheater that held we had 3,500 people at a town hall. And some of them were saying crazy things, that the legislation had things in it that it didn't have, making accusations of conspiracies, etc. That's the challenge we're in. And those people are all, as Norm Ornstein said, fueled by very narrow websites and social media accounts that say things that are not true, and then they come to a town hall and yell at you and say, I mean, there are crazy things being said right now. So that's the challenge. How do we be available, present, honest with our constituents while dealing with dangerous, paranoid threats and sometimes fueled by violent threats? It's not easy, but we have to solve it, or what's the choice? So it's a long answer.
Wonderful. What time is it?
I think it's time. Thank you. Next week, Ambassador Mark Stanley and Bob Mary, if you want to see more of the PowerPoint that I prepared and PDF, I think you'll find some very interesting things there. Thank you for joining us again tonight.
No, quiero hacer un especial reconocimiento a Sol Ibarra, Soledad Ibarra, que es la intérprete, que la verdad está haciendo un trabajo extraordinario porque recibimos muchas felicidades.
Gracias. Hasta la próxima lunes.
Gracias, congresista. Gracias a todos. Nos vemos. Adiós.